Good afternoon once more, ladies and gentlemen. In the interest of time, we will start. I wish to once more welcome every one of you that is joined our meeting today. So you will note that if you have had time to look at our auditing chief examiner reports, from time to time, you will notice that the pass rate is usually not impressive. And so as an institute, we are concerned and wish to find ways and means of getting this performance improved. And one of the ways we have identified is through the continued holding of these examination answering techniques meetings. So we hope that as you listen to what our seasoned examiner and lecturer, Mr. Mumburuma, has to offer us, we hope that it helps you as you finalize your preparations for the December 2025 exam session. Please listen attentively. Where you may have questions, feel free to ask at the appropriate time. And then just for your information, I wish to make mention that this recording together with the presentation will be sent hopefully by close of business tomorrow. And then for those of you that are registered for more than just one paper, I wish to make mention that we still have one more session that you can attend, which is the financial management session tomorrow. That is for those that are obviously in the CA. And then the Monday one, by virtue of you finding yourself in this meeting, because you have registered for either CA2.3 or DA11, it means you do not qualify for the advanced audit paper. And then just some housekeeping. Make sure that your mic is muted whenever it is not your turn to speak. And thank you. Mr. Mumbruma, you can pick it up from there.
Thank you, Mr. Katungu, for the kind introduction. Welcome, colleagues, to today's interactive virtual examination techniques presentation in preparation for the December 2025 examinations. I do hope that you benefit something, and the whole purpose really is to enhance our chances of passing these exams. Like Mr. Katungu explained earlier on, sometimes or in certain settings, the performance in these two papers, CA2.3 and DA11, has been poor, and hence this initiative of going through a few tips and going through certain areas of the syllabus to try and increase your chances of passing this particular exam. And so to begin with, we'll just quickly look at the terms of reference, which I think you must know from the notice that was sent to you with regards to what we are supposed to go through today. I must say that actually we'll do a little more than what the terms of reference say, in the sense that a few more additional topics or items have been included, which we thought are quite important as you prepare for the examinations. And so even as we go through this, please take note. If you have any issues, if you've got any questions, just jot them down so that at the end of it all, we can then attempt to answer those questions that you might have, which will help you as you prepare for the exams. We've got the contents of whatever is contained in here. This will be for the purposes of going through when you review the presentations at a later stage. But the main objective really is to give you, the candidates, a forum whereby you can interact with us and ask any questions that you may feel are necessary or which may help you even as you prepare for the examinations. And also to highlight the main problems encountered by candidates in the major syllabus areas, having gone through the student scripts and so on. We'll be able to highlight most of it. Will obviously come, you will be aware of it from the examiners' comments that are shared with students after every examination session. And then, of course, to discuss the exam technique, which you could possibly use to increase your chances of passing the exams. And then finally, to respond to any questions that you might have as we go through. And so to start with, I think it's very important as you prepare for exams, especially those who may be sitting for the first time, to ensure that they go through the syllabus and syllabus weightings and understand what the syllabus requirements are. You need to obviously identify the task ahead of you even as you start preparing for these particular exams. And you see the syllabus is divided into units. And for this 2.3 exam, CA2.3, it has got 5 units, purpose and context of an audit, corporate governance, audit planning, risk, applying techniques, and then finally review and reporting. And each of those units have got an equal weighting of 20%. What that 20% means, colleagues, is that of the total 120 marks in a typical examination paper like this one, when you look at this examination paper, the one for the last exam, the total number of marks here are 120. And considering those syllabus weightings of 20%, it means each one is weighted equally. Ordinarily, each of those units must have at least a maximum of 24 marks in each paper. And so that tells you that there's no unit that is unlikely to be examined. So all units, you cannot take chances and leave out some units as you prepare for the exam. So there will be a maximum of 24 marks per unit in a typical 120 mark question. Of course, there's that option where you leave out one question. In the case of the diploma, there is 5%, 10%, 5%. All this is in your syllabus to show the syllabus weightings, which are basically an indication of the importance of the particular topics under that particular unit. And again, we've shown you the equivalent marks of the 125 in the case of DA11 that you expect to find in a typical examination paper. And so just by looking at this, it is quite clear that you cannot leave out some topics unattended to or not studied fully. And that is the whole idea of examination. Want to ensure that you can be able to answer questions from all areas or all parts of the syllabus. In terms of the structure of the exam, again, just as a reminder, the CA2.3 has got 2 parts, Section A and Section B, with Section A comprising 1 compulsory question of 40 marks each. Or 40 marks rather. And then Section B has got 4 optional questions of 20 marks each, and candidates are required to attempt any 3 questions, giving the 100% that they will ultimately attempt. For the DA11, the paper is divided into 2 parts as well. And the first part, or part A, has got 2 compulsory questions of 25 marks each, which means a total of 50 marks is compulsory in the case of the diploma paper. And then they've got 3 optional questions of 25 marks each, out of which candidates are required to attempt any 2. And I think it's important to know this. It has been experienced in the past that some students, for example, in the diploma paper, will only attempt 1 compulsory question, and yet both questions are supposed to be attempted. And there's no choice, really. Instructions must be followed. And therefore, let's just make sure we understand the structure of the exam. And the optional questions, only 2. Again, there was an incident where a student attempted all 3 questions. And then obviously, only 2 questions were marked. All questions were actually marked, but marks were only awarded for the best 2 in the optional section. So please, let's make sure we understand. Otherwise, it will be a waste of time attempting all 3 questions when only 2 are required. We need to know the learning outcomes for both papers, CA2.3 and DA11. In other words, what is expected of us after we complete these particular papers. I think I want to draw your attention to the verbs that are used in the learning outcomes. You will notice it's basically explaining, and explaining with limited evaluation on internal controls and quality of audit evidence, and applying appropriate procedures, evaluating results of evidence, and reporting appropriately. But by and large, the requirement at this level for 2.3 is that we should be able to explain concepts, we should be able to explain principles clearly to enable the markers award you marks. And you will find that that is exactly the same also with the diploma paper, DA11. Candidates will be required to explain a little bit of evaluation and identification, but basically is to be able to explain. And remember, this paper, the CA2.3 is the first of two papers in the program, the CA program. There is an advanced paper, and so it prepares you even as you transition, as you go to do the advanced paper. So it's very important that you understand this paper very well. And it's the case also with the diploma, where you use the diploma route, eventually do the CA. You are better off making sure you understand the principles of auditing at this stage. Then you find it easier to actually do the advanced paper. We're going to look at general matters related to these two papers in terms of how we can increase our chances of passing the exam and any prior knowledge that may be required, and in a little bit more detail, the verbs that are used in the examination. And so what we are saying is, for this 2.3, candidates are required to attempt to answer 4 questions, 1 compulsory question and 3 optional questions. So in theory, we are saying you should get at least 50% of each question attempted. Imagine if you get 50% of the 40, which is 20, and then 10 marks out of each of the 3 optional questions will give you 30 marks, giving a total of 50%, and then the student will have passed the exam. It's exactly the same also with the DA program, where you are expected to get at least half the marks for each of the compulsory questions and the ones that you choose to attempt of the 3 optional questions. That is the theoretical thinking. In practice, you may get more or less than these particular marks, and we'll see why. The point we are trying to draw your attention to here is that you need all the marks. You need all the marks, including the marginal marks. In a question you may think is challenging, you need those marks, and therefore we should never give up in the exam. We should attempt to answer all questions and do our best to make sure we attempt and give all the questions the time that they require. In terms of prior knowledge required, not much other than communication skills in answering theory questions. These papers are largely 90% theory. So communication skills are quite important in terms of presentation and the English as well. Because if certain words are missed or misused, then the meaning obviously changes, and it is not up to the markers or the examination team to try and think on behalf of the students. So we should ensure that we communicate effectively to enable the markers award us marks. Knowledge of financial reporting and accounting standards is essential actually to study or to prepare for an auditing paper. And this is because, remember, auditing is basically specific to financial statements. And so it's unlikely that you can audit something that you do not fully understand. And so I encourage students sometimes to have an accounting book nearby so they can make reference to the accounting aspects of the areas that are covered by their respective syllabuses. Work experience is an advantage in the sense that this is a practical paper. We teach what actually goes on out there in industry. And so you can use your practical experience to try and think through some of these questions and apply that knowledge in answering the examination questions. Although it is possible for someone who has no work experience to actually go through, the study material that is provided is adequate and sufficient enough, except that those who are working really can take advantage because they know what internal controls are. They know systems that in a company, for example, the sales system, purchases system, and so on and so on. Those are the same things that we tend to examine here. And so we should ensure also that we've got the tools that we need for us to prepare the exam. Obviously, all this, even if I'm saying it, is some things that we should have already used by now. The student handbook should be there and be referred to as often as possible because it describes there the information that we need. It describes the knowledge that we have, and therefore we should ensure that we have the student handbook as well. The study manual, preferably a hard copy. Some students prefer a soft copy. It's a bit, I think maybe I'm from the old order. A hard copy is better. You can go through it, you can come back to it, you can scribble in it and so on. So it would be recommended that you use a hard copy of a study manual, particularly if you are studying for the first time. The practice and revision kit, obviously, is also essential. It would be a good idea to have an insight of the Accountants Act, the provisions of the Accountants Act, because we are training to be accountants ourselves. In terms of the verbs, we've already talked about them when we are looking at the learning outcomes. largely we are required to explain the most common verb used per learning outcomes. Evaluate, such as internal controls, for example. You are given a scenario where there are internal controls over a system. It may be the wages system, payroll system, inventory system, and so on. Evaluating the internal controls, then the question will be surrounding that evaluation. To apply procedures, to be able to suggest appropriate audit procedures to be undertaken, and then of course to report appropriately and this has got relevance to reporting the last chapter of each of the syllabuses, and to be able to identify and describe matters that may be contained in a scenario and required by the examiner. So it's explain, it demonstrates how an auditor plans an audit, evaluate the effectiveness of internal controls, assess risks, be able to assess risks and identify. Again, for the CA2.3, it's explain, evaluate, apply, and report appropriately. Now, I picked a few extracts from some sources. As you can see, in this case, I'm talking about the DA11 study manual. And I was particularly interested in 7.1, where it says, study the whole syllabus. You need to be comfortable with all areas of the syllabus. The format of the paper allows the examiner to cover most of the syllabus, as we saw in the syllabus weightings. So you cannot afford to omit any part of it. Question spotting is unwise and not recommended. And this is just basically copied and pasted here from the study manual. And it's important that we should know this even as we prepare for the exam. And therefore, we just have to go through the whole syllabus. And then 7.2 talks of lots of question practice. You can develop application skills by attempting the questions within each chapter, first of all. Then question practice is also a key part of your revision and will allow you to develop your application skills. Answering the questions with
watermelon. Watermelon.
markers are able to award marks depending on how you present your answer, how you argue to support your answer. Let's quickly look at the performance in the last two sittings. I thought this time around we are going to look at September and the June exam sitting and see if there's an improvement. Okay, we'll begin by considering the DA11 paper. Out of a total number of candidates who sat for this exam in September of 76, the number that passed was 15, which is 19%. Not very good. 19%, 19.7% passed the exam. Compared to June, out of 153, 77 or 50% passed the exam. So you can see, like Mr. Katungu explained earlier on, it fluctuates. Okay, the overall average score in September 2011 was 36%, and it was higher in June at 45%. And that indicates that the level of knowledge or understanding is slightly poor, or at least was shown to be poor in September compared to June. And then the average score of those that passed the exam, it was 56. Again, you see a drop there. The average score is 53, which means really the performance in September appears to have been worse off than it was in June. And then the average score of those that failed. Now look at this. Of the candidates that failed, the average score was 34% in June and 31% in September, which is quite low, really, signifying...
Mr. Momboluma.
Hello?
We had an internet outage, and so yes, we had an internet outage, and what you are sharing is not we are not able to see. Okay, now
is it okay now?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
All right, I'll begin on this slide again. I'll go back to this slide in case some people missed it. I was saying we are comparing the September and the June 2025 examination results. And we can see that the performance from June to September has actually gone bad, in the sense that the percentage pass rate for September is 19.7 compared to 50% in June. And then the average score also dropped significantly from 45% to 36%. And the average score of those that passed the exam again dropped from 56% to 53%. What is even more disappointing is the average score of those that failed the exam. 34%, meaning even if these people are given an additional 23 marks, only very few would marginally pass the exam. 34% in June and 31% in September. And the number of those that attempted less than the required number of questions. Now, this is very important. In June, 22 candidates who sat for this paper attempted 3 or less questions, and the average score was 33%, showing that actually time was not the factor, because if time was the factor of these 3 questions that they attempted, the average score should have been much higher than 33%. There was a drop in the number of those who attempted less than the required number of questions to 10 in September, with an average of 28%. Now let's look at 2.3. In June, the pass rate was 57%. It has dropped significantly, actually, in September to 34.6% of the 136 candidates that attempted the paper. And then the average score, again, you can see significantly dropped. Average score is below 50%. It was 39.6%, signifying that actually the majority scored very low marks indeed. Okay, and then the average score of those who actually passed the exam, the 47 who passed the exam, was 53. Okay, and yes, 53, and then the average score of those that failed dropped to 32.9% from 36%. And so we can see evidence that actually the performance is not that good. It was good for June in terms of, say, 2.3, where it was 53%, but it dropped significantly. We hope that during this exam session, there will be an improvement. And so let's talk briefly about assurance engagements. I think it's important we understand the whole concept of audit, colleagues. Everything in auditing surrounds financial statements like the ones that I'm holding in my hand here. The whole purpose of an audit is for auditors to give assurance to some interested parties. In this case, we are talking about separation between management and ownership, whereby the owners of these companies, particularly big, large multinationals and public listed entities, the owners do not take part in the day-to-day running of the company. And so management are basically accountable, and they are stewards or agents of those who own the company. So management are acting on behalf of the shareholders in this case, and they must operate in a manner that is in the interest of the shareholders. And so we talk of corporate governance in terms of how organizations should be run and controlled, considering the board of directors, considering the meetings that should be held, the committees of the board, and so on. Very, very important to try and ensure that companies or organizations succeed to the benefit of the shareholders and so on. And so the objective of the auditor, the purpose or the objective of the statutory audit is to form an opinion based on evidence, because the only link that is there between management and the shareholders is the financial statements prepared by management. And therefore, there is a risk that management may falsify the financial statements to show a good picture than is really the case, and hence the need for independent verification and for the auditor to form an opinion. And therefore, the shareholders appoint auditors to conduct audits and then report back to the shareholders. Very, very important. And in so doing, obviously, professional ethics for accountants come in, both with regards to the accountants working in the office and preparing the financial statements, and also the auditors who actually audit the financial statements. Okay, internal audit and reliance on the work of internal audit is something that we are going to look at a little further as we move on. And so the main elements of an assurance engagement, this relationship between management, the shareholders, and the auditors is known as an assurance engagement. And it has got 5 elements. Let's make sure we know those 5 elements. It has got 5 elements, namely a criteria, which means the financial standards, the financial reporting standards that the accountants use to prepare the financial statements. The criteria will be the benchmark against which the auditors will be measuring how the financial statements have been prepared. And then, of course, we've got the report, which is the outcome of the audit. That is another element. Then we've got the evidence. The auditors cannot form an opinion unless they pick or they obtain sufficient appropriate evidence, which will form the basis for the opinion. The subject matter is the financial statements. What is at the center of the engagement is the financial statements prepared by management. And then it's a 3-party relationship, meaning the client itself, the client company, the shareholders, and the auditor. Client company meaning the management, the shareholders, and the auditors. Quite important to make sure we know these. These are the easier parts of the syllabus, and we cannot afford to forego these marks. Like I already said, the need for an audit is because of the separation between management and ownership of the entity. Let's move on and look at the main stages of an assurance engagement. The main stages of an assurance engagement, which we have said is this relationship between the practitioner, the auditors, and the management and the shareholders. There's obviously the appointment of auditors, where they are appointed, and we need to know how auditors can be appointed. The ethical and the professional issues with regards appointment, quite important and regularly examined. We need to know that after appointment, the auditors then have to plan the audit. And this is the stage whereby they perform the risk assessment. Before commencing the audit work, they have to carry out a risk assessment so that they assess where the highest risk is that the financial statements could be misstated. Then after risk assessment, then the conduct of the audit or performing the audit, where the auditors now require to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. And in so doing, they will consider the internal controls and evaluate whether or not internal controls are operating. And we are going to see when we come to this chapter on internal controls. And then in the actual performing of the audit involves also substantive audit procedures, meaning the procedures that are aimed at establishing whether or not the figures in the financial statements have been misstated. Let's make sure we understand clearly the objective of tests of controls that auditors perform and the substantive audit procedures. Please do take note. If you are not sure, we are free to ask as we end the presentation later today. Then after obtaining the sufficient appropriate evidence, the auditors will review, and then finally they will conclude and then report. The report is the one that will contain the opinion. Quite important to know those stages and what is happening there. So generally what happens is at the end of the year, for example, now we are going into December, and the companies will be preparing financial statements for the year 2025. And so what will happen is the companies or the clients will provide the auditors with the trial balance and the general ledger. And now I'm assuming we know what these 2 documents are from our accounting knowledge. So the trial balance will be completed, and then the general ledger obviously will be completed because the trial balance is extracted from the general ledger. And then the details of the individual amounts in the general ledger accounts will depend on whether they are expenses and income or assets and liabilities. For income and expenses, those that are in the profit or loss account, the details will be contained in the general ledger for the whole period from January 2025, February 2025, cumulatively up to the end of the year in December 2025. But for balances, meaning the balances in the statement of financial position, the management will require to provide the auditors with the details of the makeup of the balances, because these are balances as at the end of a particular period, as on 31st December. So management will provide auditors with these schedules. Without these schedules, there's very little that the auditors can do. They precisely would not be able to commence the audit. And so the client provides the auditor with schedules, and then the auditor extracts samples. They don't audit 100%. We know that auditors do not test all transactions and balances. They will extract samples from the general ledger. They will extract samples from the schedules provided by management and perform audit procedures on those samples, and then conclude on the population based on the sample results, which we are going to see a little later, isn't it? It's important for candidates to have knowledge of the structure of audit firms and the composition of a typical audit team, because these are the terms that you will meet in the exam. We must know how a typical audit team is composed of. There's an engagement partner at the top, the audit manager, the audit senior, and audit assistants. And these are terms that you are going to see. The highest person, the most senior person, is the engagement partner, who actually is the one that forms and signs the audit opinion. Now together, colleagues, quite important. I hope we are picking up a few points, and then we'll be able to discuss when the time comes. Let's look at the appointment of auditors, or appointment as auditors, the preconditions. Exam questions have asked students explain the preconditions that must exist before an appointment is accepted. Okay, in other words, there are preconditions in the sense that they need to be present. Without these conditions, we must not accept appointment. So when we are being appointed for the first time, we must consider the ethical issues as well as the preconditions. And in terms of continuous, in other words, when we have been auditors of a particular client for a number of years, on an annual basis, we need to evaluate whether or not we want to continue with this relationship. If the preconditions do not exist, it may be reason enough for the auditors to consider resigning and disengaging. So first appointment, we want to make sure that ethical and preconditions exist. And for continuing audits also on an annual basis, someone within the firm is required to review the relationship that the firm has with the client. And if the preconditions do not exist, then we may consider resigning. When risk is above acceptable levels, again, in accepting clients or in continuing to audit, one of the major issues is for the auditor to assess the level of risk and decide what level of risk they are willing to accept. So if audit risk, the risk that figures in the financial statements may be misstated, is high and above acceptable levels, then if we are being appointed for the first time, we must consider declining the appointment. If we are auditors and we've been auditing this client for a number of years, then we might consider resigning, because the risk that we may issue an inappropriate opinion is higher than we would accept ourselves. Are we together? We should know the matters that should be considered in considering bidding for an audit service. Usually, auditors respond to invitations for bids by clients. So at that stage also, there are matters to be considered. What should the auditors consider before deciding to bid? And what matters once they've bid and maybe they are nominated to be the auditors? What matters do they need to consider before accepting nomination? There are different stages before accepting nomination. We must know that. What matters must be considered. And then the procedure for the removal of auditors must be known also, how auditors are removed, and even how auditors can resign. They don't just leave. There are procedures to follow, and therefore, in the exam, you may be given a situation where auditors have resigned inappropriately, and therefore required to just explain to show that you understand what the procedures are, or they may ask you a straightforward question to explain the procedure that auditors should follow when resigning. Then, of course, the letter of engagement, once they've accepted appointment, and the contents of the letters of engagement we must know, and also the need to change the terms of the engagement. In other words, the engagement letter can stand for a period of time, but if there's a need to amend or change, we must know and be able to identify that there's need here, and we should know the circumstances that may necessitate the terms of the engagement to be amended by the auditors. Quite important, colleagues. Okay, and so we'll move on and look at a very important part of the syllabus: planning the audit or risk assessment. Risk assessment. This standard, I'm aware that most students have a problem in remembering auditing standards, but this is one of the very important auditing standards that we must regularly refer to, that we must know. Risk assessment. Okay, basically it requires that the auditors should follow a risk-based approach to audits, whereby they first of all must assess the risk that can cause financial statements to be misstated. And the reason why they need to do that is simple, in the sense that they need to respond and be able to spend more effort or to pay particular attention to the risk areas rather than the safe areas, you see. And hence, one of the major questions that we see in the exam, in almost every examination, is to identify and explain the audit risks that exist in a particular scenario. And for us to be able to do that, we need to have good knowledge of financial reporting, because we are talking about the risks that the figures in the financial statements could be what? Could be misstated. And therefore, you can only know that they are misstated if you know the accounting aspects. So again, it's a timely reminder that we should go through the accounting aspects of those areas that are within our syllabus, such as inventory, such as tangible non-current assets, such as provisions, and so on. We should go through and ensure that we are comfortable and we are able to identify where things can go wrong. And once we have identified the risks, there is a standard ISA number 330, which deals with the auditor's responses to assessed risks. Okay, so the auditors have assessed the risks, and they're saying, look, having assessed the risk, you don't leave it there, you have to respond to those risks. Of course, there are specific responses depending on the nature of the risk. But this standard ISA 330 gives the general responses to assessed risks. Let me give you an example. For example, the auditors are planning an audit of financial statements, and they assess that the audit risks are quite high or is high in that particular client. And maybe it's because it's the first time that the firm will be auditing that client, or maybe that client has never had its financial statements audited by external auditors, and so the risk is considered high. The auditors may respond in any of the following ways. Okay, they will emphasize the need for the audit team to observe professional skepticism throughout the audit. That is a response. You have identified that the risk is high, and therefore you emphasize to the audit team members that you need to apply professional skepticism as you conduct the audit. And then also the auditors may be careful in the way they select audit team members, having identified that the risk in this particular client is high. Therefore, when choosing audit team members, would want to choose to select people who have got more experience, people who are able to manage the risk that we identify, and also close supervision by the auditors. All these are required by that standard. General responses to the assessed risks. Close supervision, meaning the audit team will be closely supervised by the senior members of the audit teams. And also, lastly, to bring in unpredictability, where the auditors will change tactics because the risk is high. They may decide to do things that they've not done before. For example, maybe they've not attended inventory count at one of the major locations. They may, in this case, decide to actually go and attend inventory count. Quite important, isn't it? And in risk assessment also, the risk of fraud must be considered. Very, very important. Fraud, laws and regulations and responsibilities of management and the auditor. The risk of fraud is considered a significant risk because fraud can result in the financial statements to be misstated. And the reason is when fraud has taken place, there will be efforts to try and conceal it so that it's not seen. And yet the financial statements could be misstated. So we need to consider the risk of fraud. We need to consider the risk that the entity may not comply with laws and regulations. ISA number 250. Because if the laws and regulations are not complied with, then the financial statements could be misstated and so on, isn't it? We need to know what the audit strategy is and what the audit plan is as we are planning an audit. What is supposed to be contained in the audit strategy? What is supposed to be contained in the audit plan? Okay, and then of course the documentation. All audit work must be documented. All audit work must be documented. The documentation is the basis for the opinion. We must know the benefits or advantages of documenting. Documentation can be referred to by future audit teams. They can refer to the documentation that has been prepared by the past audit teams. And there are basically two types of files, the permanent and current audit files. Again, remember our verb, or the most likely question you will get is explain. You may be required to explain the matters that will be contained in a permanent audit file and those that will be contained in a current audit file. And in planning also, internal controls are quite important. And for both papers, DA11 and 2.3, questions have always been examined or come in terms of internal controls. We need to know the difference between the following, colleagues. And if you are not sure, please take note and ask as we end the presentation. We must know what control activities are. The actual controls, when you talk of internal controls, what are we talking about? For a particular system, such as a sales system, such as an inventory system, we must know what the control activities are. We must know what the control objectives are. In other words, why is the control being put in place in the first instance? That's the control objective. And then the test of control that should be performed by the auditors. Because questions can come with a mixture of these three particular terms, maybe requiring you to actually describe or suggest suitable controls. And from experience, I think candidates have got challenges in describing or suggesting suitable controls given a system. Okay, but when required to explain or identify weaknesses, because the weaknesses will be in the scenario, candidates tend to be able to answer that type of question much easier than where they are required to suggest controls. And the reason why candidates cannot suggest suitable controls, it means they don't understand the system. Unless you understand the sales system, unless you understand the purchasing system, only then can you be able to suggest control activities. Control objectives, you may be asked to suggest a control activity and explain or state the control objective. The test of control is the test that was the procedure that the auditors perform to test whether or not that control is operating. Are we together? And then we must know the importance of controls. What is the relevance of controls to the auditors? What is the relevance of controls? Auditors are required to obtain evidence on all material figures in the financial statements. And we said auditors cannot audit 100%. They cannot audit everything in a client company. And so there are times when they can decide to rely on the internal controls, on the effectiveness of internal controls. And therefore, before they can do that, they have to test the controls, hence the test of controls. Now, how do they rely on the controls? If the controls are found to be operating effectively, then the auditors will perform less substantive procedures. I hope we are clear on that. Once there's evidence that the internal controls are operating as expected, they are operating effectively. Instead of maybe testing 200 items, the auditors may decide to test only 150 items. They reduce the extent of substantive procedures. If, on the other hand, the controls are not operating effectively and the results of the test of control suggest so, then the auditors will not rely on the internal controls. They will perform substantive procedures largely and place no reliance, in which case they will perform more tests where they're supposed to, instead of testing maybe 150, they will test 200 items. Quite important to make sure we understand planning of an audit, colleagues. Okay. Gathering sufficient appropriate evidence. These terms are always examined and we refer to them. Gathering sufficient appropriate evidence. Sufficient in terms of quantity. The evidence that auditors obtain should be enough depending on the risk characteristics of the particular client. Appropriate is another term which is basically, is the evidence relevant, and yes, is it relevant to the purposes of the auditor? So these are two separate terms. Sufficient is with regards the quantity of evidence. Appropriateness is with regards the quality of the evidence. So in explaining that term, let's make sure that we split. We don't treat it as one term. So we have to explain what sufficient means. We have to explain what appropriate means. And this is what forms the basis of the opinion. If the auditors are not able to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence, most likely they will issue a disclaimer of opinion. So they need to obtain sufficient. What is sufficient evidence is according to the professional judgment of the audit team. We must know the financial statement assertions. Remember, we're talking about gathering evidence. Auditors have to perform audit procedures. And in performing audit procedures, they must have in mind the financial statement assertions for those particular procedures that they want to design. So assertions are basically claims by management regarding the figures in the financial statements. For example, if you talk of motor vehicles, a tangible non-current asset, management are making a claim that the motor vehicles existed at the period end. Existence is the assertion. And the auditors will design an audit procedure to test existence. And the relevant audit procedure for testing existence is to request a sample of vehicles or the vehicles to be brought to the auditors for them to inspect and physically check that they exist. So the serious relationship between financial statement assertions and audit procedures. Sometimes the examiners will require you to describe audit procedures in general without necessarily specifying the assertions. There are situations also where the examiner may require you to suggest audit procedures for specified assertions, which means if you give procedures for assertions not specified, really you will not earn any marks. Are we all together, colleagues? We've already talked about tests of controls and substantive audit procedures. Very common exam question. Explain the difference between tests of controls and substantive procedures. Really, the difference is in the objective of these. You see, the tests of controls are aimed at checking whether or not the internal controls are operating effectively, and for the auditor to decide whether or not to rely on the internal controls, while substantive audit procedures are aimed at establishing whether or not the figures contain material misstatements. And all the time, the auditors have to perform substantive procedures for material items. Are we together, colleagues? Then we talk of directional testing, quite an interesting principle. In the past, exam questions have asked students to explain what is meant by directional testing. And this is basically a technique used by the auditors, considering the double entry bookkeeping principles, where we say for every debit, there must be a corresponding what? Credit, you see. And remember, auditors are required to perform procedures to establish whether or not figures are over or understated. And so, considering the double entry bookkeeping, the accounting profession thought, look, we can perform efficient audits if we test maybe assets and expenses in one direction only. By so doing, we are indirectly testing the corresponding credit for that same item. For example, the assets and expenses are tested for overstatement. That's that's the primary test. So by primarily designing procedures to test for overstatement, we are also testing for overstatement of the corresponding credit. Hence the term directional testing. Whereas liabilities and income are primarily tested for understatement. So when you are testing those for understatement, indirectly, you are testing the related debit entries for understatement. So that overall, both debits and credits are tested for both over and understatement. Please go through, read through, and try and understand what that principle means and be able to explain in your own words to try and explain what that means. Are we all together? And in gathering evidence, we talk of sampling and performing procedures and the use of computer-assisted audit techniques. Sampling is basically where auditors select items less than the 100% of the population and perform audit procedures on the sample items. And also we must be clear in terms of the use of computer-assisted audit techniques. I think there was a question in one exam on computer-assisted audit techniques and how they can reduce a sampling risk, for example. How computer-assisted audit techniques can reduce sampling risk. And what students should have considered is that through the use of computers, taking advantage of computers, auditors can test more items. And therefore, they can test actually up to as many as 100% of the items. And therefore, by testing more items, they are reducing sampling risk, which is the risk that the auditors may issue an inappropriate conclusion because they are relying on results of a sample. Now, in terms of specific areas which we've been referring to all this time, is basically we should know the accounting for tangible non-current assets and IAS 16. If you are not sure, please go back and study, look at the financial reporting aspects so that you understand the accounting for non-current assets, including revaluation of properties and accounting for
Mr.
revaluation,
Momboloma.
depreciation, and so on and so on.
Mr. Momboloma.
Hello.
I am going to mute you for a moment so that
Yes.
we prevent the voices in the background. You will need to unmute yourself.
Okay.
You can proceed and unmute yourself.
All right. It's fine now? Okay.
Yes, it is.
We're saying, let's make sure we know the accounting. Colleagues, we cannot be auditors of things that we do not know. And there is no chancing here. If you don't know, most likely the sieve will not let you through. We need to know the accounting. Actually, auditors are supposed to be more knowledgeable in terms of accounting than the accounting staff in the office. We should know the accounting for inventory and the inventory count. The fact that inventory should be valued at the law of cost and net realizable value, and what that means, and what implications that inappropriate valuation of inventory will have on the financial statements. We must know the accounting for receivables and sales, the receivables, allowances for receivables, the cash in the bank, provisions and accruals and contingencies. Very, very important. You need to know the conditions that must be satisfied before a provision can be established. Because in designing audit procedures, you'll be considering whether or not the provisions of the accounting standard have been followed. Are we together, colleagues? You must know the provisions of the intangible non-current assets when you can capitalize, particularly things such as development expenditure and so on. We need to know the accounting. Otherwise, when it's requested or required in an auditing question to explain or describe audit procedures, and you do not know the provisions of these standards, you would definitely not be able to suggest a correct audit procedures. We need to know the accounting for capital and directors' emoluments, even where maybe shares are issued at a premium. Okay, shares, the nominal value is 1 kwacha, and the shares are issued at 1 kwacha 20 ngwe. We should be aware that the 20 ngwe should not be credited to the share capital account, but rather to the share premium account and so on, because we may be required to audit or perform audit procedures on share issues that would have occurred in a particular year. Very, very important. So once we have gathered the evidence, then we evaluate the evidence and conclude on that particular area and conclude whether or not there are any material misstatements. Are we together, colleagues? So we started with planning, now we conduct the audit, and then you review you conclude, and then finally you review. Towards the end of the audit, work has to be reviewed. Obviously, even during the audit seniors, the audit supervisors will continuously review and monitor how work is going. But the reviews is basically the final stage towards the end of the audit. Okay, the review of the audit work, the audit team, the engagement partner, audit manager, audit seniors, and audit assistants. Basically, what happens is the work that is done by audit assistants is reviewed by the audit senior. The work that is generated by the audit senior and that also done by the audit assistants is reviewed by the audit manager. And these reviews are evidenced in what? In writing. And then ultimately, the engagement partner also performs a review of the work that has been done. We must be aware of subsequent events, which means we need to know again the accounting for subsequent events, IAS number 10 and ISA number 560. Very, very important. IAS number 10 on subsequent events, meaning adjusting and non-adjusting events, and then the standard that gives guidance to the auditors in terms of the work that the auditors need to perform with regard to subsequent events. We must, there are important dates that we must be clear about in terms of the end of the audit, the date of signing the report. The year end comes, let's say, 31st December 2025. The next important date will be the date of signing the report, when the auditors sign the report. After signing the report, the next event is the issue of the financial statements, where they are posted or issued to the shareholders. And then after issue of the financial statements is basically the annual general meeting at which the financial statements are considered. And in reviewing, we must also be very clear with regards going concern and its impact. What are the responsibilities for going concern between management and the auditors? What is the importance of going concern? Obviously, to do with the basis of preparing the financial statements. If a company is not a going concern, then the financial statements are required to be prepared on a breakup basis, or what they refer to as an alternative basis. And so if the auditors need to know and assess management's assessment, evaluate management's assessment that they prepared the accounts on the right on the right basis. Are we together? We must know the responsibilities. We must know the indicators of going concern problems. If we are answering a risky question, for example, we look out for indicators of going concern and be able to say what impact they might have on the company. And these are classified into financial indicators, operational indicators, and other indicators. Financial indicators largely to do with ratios and the financial statements. Operational indicators, matters such as lack of raw materials, lack of foreign exchange, and so on. Now we are together with strikes, labor disputes, and so on with staff. Other indicators could be other indicators other than operational and financial, such as maybe a new law that has come in, that has been enacted by the government, which adversely affects the company. We must be able to identify and say what risk this may cause, particularly with regards to the ability of the company as a going concern. We must know material uncertainty and the impact that it has on the opinion. Okay? Material uncertainty and the impact that it has on the opinion, basically to do with the disclosures and so on. And then, of course, uncorrected misstatements that could be contained in the financial statements. So very together. Let's think or let's talk about reports in a more detailed manner. The reports, we said one of the elements of an assurance engagement is the report. The report is the one that contains the opinion of the auditors. And there are a number of auditing standards which we must know, colleagues. And there's evidence that most of us do not bother or do not really understand fully what these audit procedures say or provide. The first one is basically the ISA number 700, forming an opinion in the independent auditor's report. Forming an opinion in the independent auditor's report, that is ISA number 700. It's an example of an unmodified opinion. It gives, this standard gives a typical standard example of an unmodified opinion. And what it is, colleagues, is that auditors have no choice, they have no option but to follow this standard. We're together. The set of accounts I have here, I hope you are seeing it, is for 2024. And Deloitte were the auditors of this particular client. And when you look at the format of this report, the auditor's report on this page and on the next page, it's exactly the same as the one that is given by ISA 700. If they go contrary to that, then they are not auditing according to auditing standards. And it's a requirement that auditors should follow auditing standards, you see. So this is an example of an unmodified report and opinion. Now, maybe at this level, but let me say it. I'm saying an unmodified report and opinion. Maybe let's deal with each one of those in turn. An unmodified report is one which does not contain an emphasis of matter paragraph and another matter paragraph, like is the case with ISA 700. That is an unmodified report. An unmodified opinion, now we are referring to the opinion on the financial statements, is where the auditors have obtained sufficient appropriate evidence and they are happy and they have no matters of concern, and therefore they issue an unmodified opinion. Are you together, colleagues? Let me just take some water. Okay, an unmodified opinion. Now, what is important with regards this standard, ISA 700? We must know the order in which these elements fall, because we can be asked in an exam to explain or to identify where they have not been actually followed the order of the standard that is given. I'm just trying to extract it so that we try and illustrate what we are talking about, colleagues. Okay. Right, just a second. The elements of an audit opinion are as given in that standard, and therefore this order must be followed, the order that is here. The first item should be the name of the firm, then it has an addressee, it has an opinion paragraph, it has got a basis of opinion, the way they are itemized in ISA 700. That is the order in which they are supposed to be followed. Now, in the exam, what you could be given is an extract or a suggested audit report with these elements mixed up. And all you're required to do is to say this one shouldn't have been here, this one should have been in the next paragraph, and even the contents of each of those reports. So you would do well to read through the contents of ISA 700 so that you know when we talk of other information, what should be included in the other information paragraph. When you talk of key audit matters, what should be included in the key audit matters paragraph. Because the examiner may just mix them and then you'll be confused and so on. Are we together, colleagues? Another standard that has to do with the audit reports is ISA 701, communicating key audit matters in the independent auditor's report. Okay, now this was introduced, I think, in 2019. The idea is for the auditors to be more informative to the users of financial statements. It's a paragraph where the auditors put in matters that they would have come across, any challenges that they may have come across during the course of the audit, which could have been resolved. They would need to communicate those so that the shareholders and the users of the financial statements know what matters the auditors went through. And for listed companies, it's mandatory that a key audit matters paragraph should be included. For non-listed companies, it's optional. Okay. Now, what we mean by it's mandatory, even where the auditors feel they have no key audit matters to report on, they are required to actually show that paragraph and explain what the purpose of the paragraph is and the fact that they do not have any key audit matters to report on. Then we have got ISA 705, which is modifications to the opinion of the independent auditors. And I'm sure we'll come and we'll look in a few slides from now how the auditors may decide to modify an opinion. This is where the auditors have got a matter of concern and they are of the view that they cannot issue an unmodified opinion. Hence, they need to issue a modified opinion. They have a matter of concern, and that matter of concern must be material. I think it's important to emphasize at this stage. Because if the matter is not material, colleagues, then it will not result in a modification of the opinion. So the first thing is this matter of concern material? If it is material, then it is reason enough to suggest that a modified opinion should be given. We must be aware of the three forms of modifications. There's qualified opinion, adverse opinion, and disclaimer of opinion. Please, qualified opinion is not the same thing as except for opinion. There's nothing like that in the standard. The standard talks of a qualified opinion. Except for is the form of wording for a qualified opinion. A lot of students sometimes refer to a qualified opinion as an except for opinion. We need to understand the terms. Auditing has got a language. We must use the right language in describing particular matters. Are we together? And in forming in modifying an opinion, other than materiality, the auditors will need to consider the pervasiveness of the matter. How important is it? How does it impact the users of the financial statements? That's what will determine the form of modification. Because remember, of the three forms of modification, only one can be issued at any particular point in time. So we must be able to say, given these circumstances, the opinion should be a qualified opinion, or should be an adverse opinion, or a disclaimer. Are we together? Very, very important. And then we should also be clear on whether the auditors have obtained sufficient, appropriate evidence, or there was a limitation of scope. And we'll see how those things are done. And then ISA number 706, that's another standard on reporting. Emphasis of matter paragraphs and other matter paragraphs in the independent auditor's report. These have been examined several times in the past, requesting students to explain the meaning or the use of these paragraphs. And to a large extent, students fail to actually explain this. And yet, emphasis of matter, for example, is a paragraph that basically is for the auditor to emphasize, like the name is suggesting. Emphasis is coming from emphasize. It's a paragraph in which the auditors will emphasize a matter that has been correctly accounted for in the financial statements. There is no dispute, but the auditor feels if it's of such importance that they need to emphasize that matter. And so they will basically just refer to that matter. We refer you to note so and so in the financial statements and emphasize that. Are we all together, colleagues? Quite important to know the difference. There's an overlap between the emphasis of matter paragraph and the key audit matters paragraph, because both of them deal with matters that are in the financial statements. And so the auditors have to choose whether a matter should be in the key audit matters paragraph or the emphasis of matter paragraph. But with regards the other matter paragraph, it's a paragraph that the auditor uses to explain other matters that don't need to be in the financial statements. For example, if the previous year financial statements were audited by different auditors, we are auditing them for the first time. The auditors may want to explain that in the other matter paragraph in the auditor's report. Are we together, colleagues? And so again, we must be very careful in terms of the contents, because the examiner may put in matters, for instance, may put in this matter which is supposed to go in the emphasis of matter paragraph in a draft, in the a matter that should have come in the other matter paragraph. They may put it in the emphasis of matter paragraph. We must be able to identify and say, no, this is inappropriately so, and therefore should be in the other matter paragraph. We can only do that if we understand each one of those fully. Okay. Then another standard that is on reporting is the other information paragraph. Other information, ISA number 720. You see, it's interesting when you look at a set of financial statements like this one I'm holding in my hands. It has got how many pages? 86 pages. But the auditors in their audit report, okay, let me just refer to it. In the auditor's report, they're saying we've audited the accounts set out on pages 37 to 74. 37 to 74. So what is contained on pages 1 to 33? This is other information. Are we together? In other words, it has got the director's report, the chairman's report, some ratios, and a number of other things. And financial statement, the documents containing financial statements can have a lot of other information like ratios, maybe performance of the company over the last 10 years, and so on. But the auditors make reference to the financial statements only. So anything else is other information. And the standard ISA 720 gives guidance on the responsibilities of the auditor on other information. The reason why auditors get concerned or need to ensure that the other information are not contradicting the evidence they've obtained is that they can be read together, you see. And so the standard requires that the auditor should read the other information and look out for any inconsistencies between the other information and the financial statements or the knowledge that they have of the entity, and request that corrections be made. Quite important, colleagues. Okay. And then we must know also the difference or the report to management. ISA 2.65 is another standard. As auditors conduct audits, they will come across deficiencies in internal controls in a client company. Remember, in planning the audit, they would have recorded the control activities. They will perform tests of controls. And so they will come across deficiencies. These deficiencies are supposed to be reported, or yes, reported to management through a letter to management or the internal control, a letter of weakness. And the ISA number 265 gives guidance. An exam question gave, I think, 2 internal control weaknesses and required the students to draft or to illustrate what information would be contained in a letter of weakness. First, you must understand what that letter of weakness is and the fact that it must contain information that must be communicated, deficiencies in internal control. So basically, what the auditors will do is to explain what the deficiency is, is to explain what the implication of the deficiency is and what recommendation that the auditors are making, and then the response of management. Quite important that we understand those, colleagues. Okay. Let's go back and look at internal controls. And there are 20% of the syllabuses. I think for 2.3 is covered in a unit that contains other items, but it's 20% of the syllabus. And you agree with me that almost every exam has good questions on internal controls. And so we can safely assume most likely we'll have a question on internal controls because it's within the syllabus. And we have said the whole syllabus must be examined. So we must know, and we know it in advance, you see. Okay, so internal controls are very, very important. We must know what the meaning of internal control and the responsibilities for internal control. Management are the ones responsible for running the company. It is not the auditors. Management is responsible for running the company. Management is responsible for putting in place internal controls that will help prevent fraud or help detect fraud and error. That's the whole objective of these internal controls. Systems cycles in a business, including inventory systems. We must know the inventory system. How is inventory kept in a particular client company? For manufacturing companies, for example. When is an order made? Who makes the order? When goods come, who receives the goods? Who checks for quality and so on? We must be very clear on the inventory system. The purchasing system. Who raises a purchase requisition? Who authorizes the purchase requisition? Is there an order? Are the orders pre-numbered, meaning they are accountable documents? We must know that. Together. When goods are received, is there a goods received not raised? Because those are the expected controls, colleagues. And if we go through past exam questions, we'll get familiar. Even if we are not in actual work environment, we should be able to know. The sales system, the payroll system, capital and revenue expenditure, and cash and bank. We must know those systems, isn't it? We need to know the documentation in each system. The typical internal control in each system, we must know. We must try and learn that, isn't it? Together, we've already explained the connection between internal control activities and control objectives. The internal control activities are put in place with a view to controlling there must be an objective, a reason why there is a control, and then the test of control. Maybe let me give an example. Okay, let's just run through the slide first. Control activities, this is the control put in place by management. The control objective is the reason for putting the control. The test of control is the one performed by the auditor to test the effectiveness or lack thereof of the control activity. Let me give you an example. Let's say the payment system, cash and bank. Before a check is raised or a transfer of funds is made, there must, for a purchase of goods, maybe we have bought goods from a supplier, there must be an original copy of the supplier invoice. There must be a copy, a payment voucher copy of the order. There must be a copy of a goods received note. Okay, basically these three. Then, of course, the payment voucher. Now, what is the control? The control is that, first of all, these must be originals. That's a control in itself. The fact that only originals should be able to support a payment. Because if you allow photocopies to support a payment, it means they can payments can fraudulently be made. Okay, and then another control which you could have is once these three have been raised or have been put into to support a payment voucher, and the payment voucher has been correctly authorized and so on, we can have another control of stamping the documents with a paid stamp to show that these documents have already been used once to support a payment. That is a control. Having a paid stamp on this date, these have been paid for. That's a control. What is the purpose? What is the control objective? The control objective is to avoid the same documents being used for a duplicate payment fraudulently. Are we together? And what is the test of control? Then the auditors, when testing the control, they will pick a sample of payments that have been made and inspect the documents to ensure that they've been stamped correctly. That is the test of control. Please, let's make sure we understand this. If you understand them, then it must be easy for you to describe what is, if you are required to explain what the control objective, identify the control, you identify the control. You should be able to explain the control objective and what control, the test of control the auditors are going to use, isn't it? We're together. We've already talked about the use of internal controls by external auditors. Maybe as a matter of emphasis, we are coming across it again. The use of internal controls. In other words, when the internal controls are tested and found to have been operating well, then the auditors will reduce the extent of further procedures that will be done in terms of substantive procedures. We must know the methods of recording internal control systems and the advantages and disadvantages. I think we'll come across these we have mentioned somewhere in another slide. The methods of recording the internal control systems. Remember, we have said in planning the audit, in assessing risks, among the things the auditors need to gain an understanding of are the internal controls. And therefore, they need to record these. Otherwise, if they don't record them, how are they going to perform tests of control? And so there are a number of methods, including narrative notes, including ICQs, ICEQs, and then flow charts and so on. We must know those as well. Are we together, colleagues? Okay. Another important area in terms of controls is the components of internal control. Exam questions have asked students to explain briefly on each of these elements. In planning an audit, the auditor is required to understand the elements of internal control. And so these 5 elements are basically the control environment, clearly explained in both study materials. The control environment, how is the control environment in this particular entity? We must gain an understanding. The entity's risk assessment process. What systems does the entity have in place to identify risk? How is it coming in the topic of internal controls? Because internal controls are supposed to heal or to treat risks, things going wrong. So it is expected that the company has got a risk assessment process. We, the auditors, need to gain an understanding of how does this entity assess its risks. Because if they don't have a robust risk assessment system, then most likely there are no suitable controls, and therefore we will choose not to rely on the controls, isn't it? The auditors need to know another element is the information system that is in use with computerization now. Auditors need to know what accounting package does the client use, for example. They need to gain an understanding of the control activities themselves. The actual internal controls is another component of internal controls, and what systems the entity has in place to monitor these controls to make sure that they are operating, and if need be, introduce further controls and so on, isn't it? So the use of internal control systems basically depends on the results of tests of control. A lot of emphasis. We are keeping on saying the same thing. If the results of the test of control suggest that the controls are effective, then we can follow a combined approach and rely on the controls. What we mean is we'll test less items than if the controls were not operating. If the results of the test of control suggest that the controls are ineffective, then the auditors will follow a substantive audit approach and will place no reliance on the internal controls. Are we together, colleagues? All right. We've already talked about the recording, the accounting and control systems. We thought we should just remind ourselves here as well. You've got narrative notes where the auditors, as they gain an understanding, they will be taking note. They will take note. They will record whatever they are coming across in terms of their accounting system for each cycle and so on. We're together. We must know the advantages and disadvantages of each of these, mind you. Questions have come. Explain 2 methods of recording an accounting system and explain one advantage each. Students lose marks just for simple basic things and so on. Flowcharts is another method. Questionnaires, and the questionnaires are basically into 2: internal control questionnaires and internal control evaluation questionnaires. We're together. And then checklist is another method. Please, you do well to go through those as well. Like we've said, we must know the internal control advantage, the methods advantages and disadvantages. Okay, let's look at the exam now and talk a little more about internal controls and the exams. Candidates may be required to do the following in the examination. We may be required to do the following. identify and explain the internal control weaknesses and suggest suitable improvements. So you are given a scenario, what are the weaknesses? And usually the weaknesses are so obvious that a person who has gone through the syllabus shouldn't have difficulties in being able to pinpoint that there's a weakness here. For instance, the examiner says the purchase orders are not pre-numbered. Just that statement alone is suggestive of something that is wrong, meaning they should have been pre-numbered. And so you just explain the weakness of the fact that the purchase orders are not numbered and suggest suitable improvements, which means, like in this case, you're going to say, oh, the purchase orders must be pre-numbered. So they are accountable documents, and therefore none could be abused. Now, in the exam, some students will identify the weakness, and then they will not suggest a suitable improvement. And yet maybe it's for 10 marks, 5 weaknesses and 5 improvements. If you don't suggest the improvements, then colleagues, you will not get your marks, which are allocated for that. So we just make sure that we address all the question requirements, and we see how presentation comes in. Identify and explain the internal controls. Okay, we've talked about that. Suggest suitable internal control activities using information. So in this case, they just give you, this is the system. Can you suggest internal controls? It requires a little bit more of being imaginative and using your knowledge or understanding of the particular activity. And you should be able to suggest suitable controls. And please, when examiners require you to maybe identify and explain 5 weaknesses or suggest 4 control activities, let's try and suggest that number of control activities. Otherwise, if we give 2, we will be marked out of the 2. Only the correct 2 will be given marks. Otherwise, we lose marks, isn't it? Explain the test of controls for a given internal control activity. They give you the internal control. They give you that the control is this. Then you explain the test of control. Using the information in this scenario, it could be 1, 2, and 3. Suggest internal control activities that should be put in place. Explain the control objective for each of those, and explain the test of control. Columnar form of presentation will be more appropriate here, so that it's clear. The examiner should have no difficulties knowing which internal control activities you have suggested and what the control objective for those activities are and what the test of control is, isn't it? Explain the objectives of test of controls and explain the impact of test of controls in an audit. Explain the information that should be contained in a letter of weakness. We saw the letter of weakness there. Explain the limitations of internal controls. These are the typical exam questions that have been tested in the past, in the revision kit, and will continue to be tested under the syllabus even in future. And so really, we just have to make sure we do what we learned, what we looked at in the first 1 or 2 slides, which says don't attempt to read everything in the study manual. Now, what are the common mistakes with regards internal controls? Failure to suggest suitable internal control activities. When you are required and you just fail, you don't even suggest anything. That is common. Failure to explain the control objective, why the whole control is there in the first place. The easiest way to remember or to suggest a control objective is you should ask yourself, why is this control being put in place? That is what will give you the control objective. Sometimes students explain management responses to control weaknesses. They start explaining what you are trying to explain the weaknesses, but then you start explaining what management should do. Or when required to explain test of control, you are required to explain test of control, you are starting to explain what the management response should be to the weaknesses. Let's make sure we read the question requirement carefully and understand it. Poor presentation of answers when required to suggest internal control activities, state control objective, and suggest suitable test of control. Poor presentation can cost you marks if the examiners cannot be able to relate these correctly. Clear or lack of understanding of the use of internal control. A lot of students actually do not understand what we mean by the results of the test of control determining the nature and the extent of further audit procedures. Please, we hope we have understood. However, together, and remember, internal control is 20% of the DA11 syllabus, and it forms part of 20% of the other one. So examination questions are likely to always include questions on this important area of the syllabus. It's important also for the auditors, whether as an external auditor or even as an accountant in the office, we need to know internal controls, and therefore don't disregard this important area of the syllabus. Okay. Substantive audit procedures, we've already mentioned them in passing. They are basically of two types: analytical procedures and tests of detail. The objective is obviously to test for misstatements of the figures and related disclosures. Remember, the objective of the auditor is to form an opinion on whether or not the financial statements are materially misstated. And so, to test for misstatement, the auditors need to perform substantive procedures. This is what actually auditing is. The substantive procedures should be so clear such that a person who doesn't know can be able to follow and perform those audit procedures. This is what guides the auditors. It's what guides the audit assistants to perform audit work. And therefore, it's very key to the subjects. And so all the time you'll be required to suggest suitable substantive procedures. If you understand clearly the relationship between financial statement assertions and audit procedures, you should have no difficulties. I'm aware that in the study manuals, they give us the assertion, they give us the typical the audit procedures, but we can't memorize those. The best approach, colleagues, is to understand what is being done here, is to understand that management is making a claim about the figures contained in the financial statements. And we must know what those claims are. For instance, in terms of inventory, management is making a claim that inventory has been valued appropriately at the law of cost and net realizable value. And therefore, audit procedures will be surrounding that same assertion that is being made. So if your knowledge of financial statement assertions is poor, most likely you have challenges in describing audit procedures. And even when you go to the workplace, if you're going to work as an auditor, then you might have challenges to actually conduct audits. So we really need to make sure we get it. And therefore, the meaning of financial statement assertions and relationships to audit procedures is very important. Describing substantive audit procedures to test given assertions or generally audit risks for specific figures in the financial statements. We must know what can go wrong in the financial statements for those particular figures. That's what will help us in terms of substantive procedures. It says, let's look at substantive audit procedures and the exams. You may be required to do the following in the examinations related to audit procedures. Explain audit procedures for given figures, explaining the financial statement assertion. Maybe is tangible non-current assets. What are the audit procedures? Explain 5 audit procedures, clearly stating the assertion being tested. They just want to establish whether you know the relationship between assertions and the procedures. Or explain the audit work you expect to find on tangible non-current assets in a review of audit working papers. In other words, you are reviewing work that has been done. And if you are reviewing work that has been done, you must know what to expect. And so they tell you, can you describe or explain the work that you expect to have been done on receivables, for example? Explain the meaning of financial statement assertions using suitable examples. Explain the financial statement assertions being tested by a given set of substantive audit procedures. Imagine they give you, in other words, they tell you that we are going to audit, let me see, what example can I give? We're going to audit receivables. And in doing so, we have done this and this and this. Then they just want you to explain the assertions that are being tested. Are together, colleagues? It's quite, and all that it requires that you must know the meaning of assertions, the relationship of assertions and audit procedures. And then you're able to actually do that without much of a problem. In terms of the challenges met by students or shown, the evidence that is there, explaining procedures for assertions not required. The examiner has said, can you explain the procedure for existence? Then you start talking about inspecting the white book, which is a procedure for rights and ownership. Then obviously you will not get a marks. It means you have shown that you don't know the procedure for existence. Together, explaining financial statement assertions in describing audit procedures were not required by the question. So you start explaining the assertions instead of stating what work the procedure is. What work will the auditors do? Are we together? You cannot say in an audit procedure, auditors will have to perform audit procedures. Those audit procedures are what the examiner wants you to demonstrate that you know. Are we together? Or indeed, sometimes students explain methods of obtaining evidence. We know the methods of obtaining evidence: recalculation, observation, inquiry, and so on. And then you start explaining those. You are supposed to use those methods to describe the audit procedure. Are we together, colleagues? For instance, inspection. You cannot start explaining inspection when auditing tangible non-current assets for existence. The procedure will be request management to make available the selection of assets, and then the auditors will inspect those. That is what the procedure is, isn't it? It's common for candidates simply not attempting to describe audit procedures. Very common that some students just leave it out completely. Leave it out. And maybe it's high time audit procedures come in the compulsory question with a significant number of marks together, so that because it's so important. It's important for a candidate, it's important for an accountant, it's important for the auditor as well. Candidates simply stating, instead of explaining, for example, simply stating recalculation. You explain audit procedures, you just say recalculation. That's not good enough. You need to explain, what are you recalculating? What document is being recalculated? Which one are you recalculating? Explain, go into details. So you won't get enough mark or maximum marks. Many candidates simply suggesting obtaining written representations, even where not relevant. It's very common. Audit procedures obtain written representations, even when it's not relevant. Yes, to a large extent, written representations are an accepted way of obtaining evidence. But you cannot conduct an audit purely by obtaining written representations. Auditors need to perform specific audit procedures on specific material items in the financial statements. We are saying this is a core area of the syllabus, and questions on this topic will feature in every examination. As long as it's an auditing exam, then the audit procedures will feature, colleagues. Okay. Let's look at answering scenario-based questions, and for which our exam is basically scenario-based. I've got in front of me the September 2025 exam for 2.3 as an example. It has got 1.5 pages of a scenario. 1.5 pages of a scenario, and a number of question requirements. And students are expected to use the information in the scenario in answering these questions. Occasionally, there will be knowledge-based questions which can be answered without referring, maybe for 2 marks, 3 marks, without referring to that information. If you do a lot of practice, past exam question practice, you will know that here I don't need to labor. I can just answer this question and so on. But largely, we need to be able to use the information in there. The only thing is, obviously, it's quite a bit of information. You go through it in the 15 minutes that you are given this part of, to study the question paper. You read through so that you have a feeling of what is contained there, having considered what information you are given in the requirements. It says requires the use of information in the scenario to answer questions. The scenario will contain information that will aid the candidates to answer the question requirements. That's the whole objective. It's not to trap students. It's to try and help you and remind you, to enable you to demonstrate that you understand. Candidates simply require to be skeptical in identifying such information. Just be critical and you'll be able to identify. And common requirements include the following: identify and explain the audit risks in the audit of, and suggest suitable responses. Identify and explain the audit risks. So which means the question 4 here was explain 4 audit risks that should be considered at the planning stage of the audit of financial statements of Livingstone. So to be able to answer that question, you must know what an audit risk is. If you don't know what audit risk is, then most likely you won't be able to identify those risks there. See? Identify and explain the ethical matters in the audit and suggest appropriate safeguards. Suggest suitable control activities for the purchases system. They give you it's a scenario. So you can only deal with the scenario, the information in the scenario. Suggest controls for that system, not any other. If you start bringing controls that they are not referring to, most likely you won't get maximum marks. Identify the internal control deficiencies and suggest recommendations to remedy the what? The deficiencies. These are scenario-based. suggest suitable internal control activities on the scenario given, and for each one, explain the control activities, suggest a suitable test of control. Common exam standard requirements are very together. So the requirement may be for identification of business and or audit risks and suggesting suitable responses. Distinction between business and audit risk is required. We must know the difference. Very common, colleagues, for candidates to explain business risks when required to explain audit risk and vice versa. Now, it's very important that we know the difference. Some risks could give rise to a business risk or an audit risk, depending on the explanation. The moment if you want to explain it as an audit risk, always remember to relate it to what could go wrong in the financial statements. Otherwise, it may only be a business risk. And the questions normally will comprise both audit risks and business risks. And then either ask you to explain a few business, a few audit risks, to try and establish whether students understand the distinction between the two. Some risks are obvious, while others are less obvious. It's true. Some risks are quite obvious. Some of them are not. The only way you can get to know most of these risks is to go through many past exam questions and answers. The fact that a company is a listed company, for example, and the nature of inventory may not be that obvious. Together, the fact that a company is a listed company, there's a risk there. There can be an audit risk that the company may not comply with listing requirements. And therefore, if there are any penalties, they may be subject to penalties. And therefore, the penalties and the provisions may be understated. And yet, the question just said it's a listed company. So that you should click in your mind. Are we going together? Sometimes the nature of the inventory, you're talking about maybe food and so on. You're talking about drugs which expire. Without saying much, the fact that this is a pharmaceutical company, it's a company that deals with drugs, manufacturing drugs. Immediately in our mind, what should come is there's a risk that inventory may be inappropriately valued between law, of course, and net realizable value. Together. So audit risks basically impact the financial statements. What could go wrong? Including accounting and disclosures according to relevant accounting standards. So really we need to know what the accounting standards say. What could go wrong, whether it's related parties, whether it's fair value accounting, whatever it is, what could go wrong? That is basically what the audit risk is all about. We need to bring to bear the accounting knowledge and determine what could go wrong in the financial statement. That is the audit risk. Audit response depends on the risk identified. Common for candidates not to explain this, resulting in losing marks allocated to doing so. Usually, they will ask you what audit response, what response are you going to give? Remember, these risks have been identified and we are saying something could go wrong. So auditors must perform, must take action to try and find out whether or not the risk has resulted in a misstatement of the financial statements. So we need to be skeptical in reading scenarios. Usually audit and business risks obvious from the information in the scenario. Look out for accounting issues in the scenario. Most likely there will be an audit risk. Any accounting, whether it's related parties, there could be a risk. Related parties, for example, the risk is that the disclosures may not be according to the related party transactions accounting standard. Assets held for sale, there's an accounting standard. We're together. So we should always think about what could go wrong in the financial statements, colleague, isn't it? Okay, I think we've dealt with that. The common mistakes explaining business risks instead of audit risks. And this has been repeated in the examiner's reports every sitting. The same observation is made. Not using the information in the scenario. Explaining the elements of audit risk. The question is asking you to identify and explain audit risks. Then you start explaining what is meant by inherent risk, control risk, and detection risk. Even if you explain them correctly, no marks will be awarded because that's not addressing or answering the question the requirements. Explaining the auditor response will not required. Sometimes the examiner doesn't require you to explain what the audit response is. Why waste time? No marks will be awarded. Yes, you may want to demonstrate that you know, but there will be no marks allocated. So let's just make sure we address the examiner requirements only, not suggesting auditor response for the risk identified when required. When you are required, you don't suggest. And then giving management responses to the risks. the responses should be from the point of view of the auditor, not management. Are we together? So some students will always talk about management responses. It's the auditor responses. Are we together? And then describing and explaining less than the required number of audit risks and not explaining the assertion that will be misstated. In describing or explaining audit risks, let's try by all means and be able to say provisions will be understated, receivables will be overstated, and so on and so on. Are we together, colleagues? Poor presentation of solutions, making it difficult for the markers to award marks. Quite important, isn't it? Okay. Let's look at a simple illustration. We thought maybe this will help us. We still have time. We are monitoring the time. We'll give you enough time to ask you questions. Let's look at this simple illustration on audit risk identification. Okay. And what we have done, we have highlighted in bold certain key issues that should come to your attention as you are reading the scenario. Okay. Your audit senior on the audit of the financial statements of TRI Limited, for example, for the year ended 30th September 2025. So it appears this one is not a listed company. So that issue of not adhering to listing requirements is not relevant. It will be the first time for your firm to audit financial statements in this industry that TRI Limited is involved in. Now, there you can see it's almost obvious that there's a risk there. And what is the risk? It's the first time that we are going to be auditing this client. And we have not audited any other client in this industry. So detection risk is high, isn't it? We're together. It's most likely there's a risk that actually we may miss out material misstatements. So we've identified the risk. How do you respond to that risk? By assigning senior people or more senior audit team members to kind of take that audit and also close supervision. Okay. In the current year, TRI Limited spent a significant amount of money on repairs and rehabilitation of its equipment. You are talking about, there are companies in Zambia, Chilanga Cement, big companies, Trade Kings, big companies which use a lot of equipment which is repaired and replaced and rehabilitated and so on. And so there you can see that there's a risk on repairs and rehabilitation because if we know our IAS number 16, we know that some expenditure on equipment may require that the expenditure is capitalized because it enhances the capability or capacity of the equipment. And so the risk there is that there will be misallocation of figures between revenue and capital expenditure. And you just explain around that, colleagues. Are we together? We need to recognize that so that we can be alert and respond appropriately. Some of the equipment in use is obsolete and the company conducted an impairment review. Now it means you need to know what the provisions of IAS 36 are. And you need to do these things very quickly because you don't have time. So impairment, and we know that in conducting impairment, there is some subjectivity. So there's a risk that this may not have been done correctly. Already we have talked about 3 or 4 risks here, isn't it? TRI Limited spent 10 million on research and development, out of which 6.4 million has been capitalized as development cost in the financial statements. Now, a student who doesn't know the provisions of IAS 38 and the guidance on research and development, they will not see that risk. But that is what we are expected, colleagues, to know. We are auditing financial statements, and these are in our syllabus, so we need to know that. It says identify and explain the audit risks in the audit of the financial statements of TRI Limited and suggest responses. I've already tried to explain what the audit risks are. Let's see. Look at the way the suggested solution has been presented. Quite neat. Are we together, colleagues? On one hand, it says audit risks, then audit response. Then you just explain line side by side. You explain what the risk is, then the audit response, and then the marker will see at a glance and award you marks appropriately. Are we together? And we are talking about the first time audit, which I've already explained, the amount spent on repairs, the amount, the impairment that has been conducted, and so on. The 5 have been given like that. Right? So presentation is quite important. This is a typical exam question with information on how to identify risks. Are we together, colleagues? All right. We'll move on. Please take note of any concerns that you might have. We still have time. We'll give you time for questions later on. Okay. Let's quickly look at fundamental ethical principles Very, very important for our profession. All professional bodies, most professional bodies have got ethics which they are supposed to follow. This defines our behavior as accountants. So we must know the fundamental principles, basically the 5 that were issued by IFAC. And these will remain so until IFAC changes them. And we know that Zika has adopted the same fundamental principles. Zika does not have its own fundamental principles, but they have said we have adopted the IFAC fundamental principles in their entirety. And these are basically integrity. And the key things there is straightforward and honest. Professional competence and due care. In other words, you, the accountant, you, the auditor, must be straightforward and honest in whatever you do. And that the idea, colleagues, is to inculcate these principles. Or yes, in our lives, they become part of our DNA. We must be straightforward and honest. And anything that shows to the contrary, then you are in breach of this fundamental principle. And technically or theoretically, you should be disciplined for not complying with that principle. Professional competence and due care. In other words, we must have the knowledge and skills necessary so that our employers where we work, they get the best. So that our clients who we audit get the best. And therefore, we need to update our knowledge. When there are changes in accounting standards, we must know. And hence, Zika runs workshops and so on to remind members of the latest developments in the profession. It's another important principle. Are we together? Professional behavior, we should comply with the laws and regulations and then avoid the conduct that will discredit the profession. You do something that will embarrass the profession. We shouldn't. We should avoid. And very basic, but very important, objectivity. We must not allow bias, conflict of interest, or undue influence of others to override professional judgments. It doesn't matter, it could be your superior who tells you to do something wrong. According to these standards, you should say, no, I'm not doing it. And that could be at the risk of you losing employment. But that's the profession we have chosen. You should say, no, I will not do it. It's against my professional beliefs and so on. I will not do that. Or confidentiality, not to disclose to third parties without permission of client or employer any information that comes to us by virtue of our employment or by virtue of our client-auditor relationship. Very important. Let's know, please, again, it's just a reminder, the 5 general threats that can cause the auditors not to comply with the fundamental principles. Self-interest threat, self-review threat, advocacy threat, intimidation, and familiarity. And you will know and you agree with me, there are a number of examples in both study materials. Actually, it's the same material in both chapters. There are a number of examples that are given for each of those. And those are the ones, colleagues, we need to know. For example, I hope you are seeing what I will show you on the screen. If you look at this, these are examples of self-interest threats. And there are more than 10. And so you should be able to, the examiners will basically pick any of those and put them in a scenario. And then I expect you to explain what the issues are. For example, this gifts and hospitality. They may suggest that the client, the client has, they may suggest that the client has suggested that they will take the audit team, for a holiday, fully paid for holiday. In which case, then you deal with that. It means they've just picked that. Are you together, colleagues? We know these, and therefore it's the same with self-review, it's the same with intimidation, it's the same with familiarity. We must know those examples. They're the ones the examiners will pick around and make a story around that. So we should know why they give rise to a threat and what safeguards should be applied. Are we together, colleagues? So not very demanding, really. Okay, and answering ethical questions, let's move on. Candidates may be required to explain the ethical principles using suitable examples, just to explain the 5 fundamental principles. And you give examples. Candidates may be required to identify and explain ethical matters in a given scenario and suggest suitable safeguards. I think we saw that. I've got the September exam for 12 marks, colleagues. It says describe 6 ethical issues that you will consider in the audit of the financial statements of Livingston PLC. Now, can you imagine this particular one? They just asked students to explain 6 ethical issues. No need for safeguards. Because if they wanted safeguards, would have said so. For 12 marks, very fair question indeed, isn't it, colleagues? Okay, so read the question carefully. The common mistakes made in answering ethical questions include the following. candidates explaining the 5 ethical principles instead of identifying and explaining ethical issues. Now, what we mean here, actually, it's not the 5 ethical principles, but rather the 5 general threats. You are supposed to identify the ethical issues. Then you go to great length to explain self-interest threat, self-review, or you would labor to say, look, what can I say about self-interest? No, you don't have to. Just read the scenario, come up with the issue, discuss the issue. You may conclude that it gives rise to a self-interest threat. Are we together? So look at the issue in the scenario. That's the one you need to deal with. That's the one you need to identify. That's the one you need to say whether or not it gives rise to an intimidation threat and so on. Don't rush to try to explain what intimidation threat is and so on. That is not correct. Candidates failing to describe the ethical issues clearly. Sometimes we talked about communication, not very clear. Candidates not suggesting suitable safeguards when required, or candidates suggesting safeguards when not required. Like in this case, I'm sure there are some candidates who gave safeguards because they are used to suggesting safeguards. But the question did not require, just wasting what? Wasting time. Poor presentation of answers instead of using columnar format. Presentation saves you on time and also makes it easier for the markers to see your answer and relate your answer. Candidates explaining less than the required number of ethical matters. If they say, colleagues, explain 5 ethical matters, it means in the scenario there are 5, they are there. Just be skeptical, be critical, look for them and explain them. We cannot afford, there are no marks lost for trying. Just try and see and say, look, I think this is an ethical issue. Explain it rather than leave it unattempted. Are we together? Let's look at it again, basically just like we saw on the risks. Let's look at a simple illustration, a simple question on ethics. It says you are an audit senior in the audit of the financial statements of Kalomo Limited for the year ended 30th September 2025. Kalomo Limited has been an audit client of your firm for 5 years. The audit fees for the past audit has remained unpaid on account of liquidity problems that Kalomo Limited is facing. Very innocent statement. Then obviously, immediately there, we were talking about the audit fee remaining unpaid. It creates a self-interest threat. Now, unless you know, unless you studied, you won't be able to pick that up. Okay, so there's one there we've already seen. In a pre-audit meeting with management, the audit team was promised a fully paid for holiday to Livingston at the end of the current audit. How obvious should questions be? Fully paid for holiday, which means it will impact on the objectivity of the auditors. And therefore, this should be declined by the audit team if you are required to suggest a suitable safeguard. It doesn't matter. The fact that the company runs a pleasure resort is here nor there. The issue is that is a fully paid for holiday must be considered as significant, and therefore the auditors should decline that. The chief executive officer of Kalomo requested the firm to give a short-term loan to the company, which will be repaid as soon as the current negotiations with its bankers are concluded. Now again, self-interest threat. The guidance says there should be no loans between the auditors and the client and the client and the auditors unless the client is a bank and the conditions are similar to anyone else. So that is an ethical issue there. He further requested that your firm continues to submit the tax returns as has been the case in the past. So he's trying to examine you. Do you know the rules with regards to tax returns? Generally, tax returns do not cause an ethical dilemma. Now, one who doesn't know that may not pick that up. In the current year, the company requires your firm to assist in the determination of the tax liability. Now there is a problem. They want the firm to help in deciding on the tax liability. That will give rise to a self-review threat. So you explain there's an ethical issue here because the auditors will be reviewing their own work, and therefore they shouldn't. It doesn't matter whether the financial controllers suddenly resigned. It is not the duty of the auditors to do that. And so unless there are safeguards, that request must be what? Declined. Are we together, colleagues? In this regard, your firm has been requested in the recruitment of a replacement because someone resigned. Now they are saying, can you help us recruit a replacement? And the auditors do offer such services. But we should have noticed that here we can't because this is our audit client. And so again, that's an ethical issue. Quite straightforward, colleagues. Of course, here what you have described is basically largely containing only ethical issues. this part on ethics and the one we looked at earlier on risk can be made into one question. Are you all together, colleagues? This could have been made into one question. If this is 10 marks and that is 10 marks, we could have made a 20-mark question considering the risks we saw earlier on and the ethics here. They'll be mixed, and then you are just supposed to identify which one is a risk, which one is an ethical issue. Are we all together, colleagues? Explain the ethical issues in the audit of the financial statements of Kalomo and suggest appropriate safeguards that should be put in place. Again, you may be able to read through. We have been told that these presentations will be shared. Look at the presentation, quite straightforward. Item 1, 2, 3, ethical matter, safeguards. Put the question number you're answering, if it's question 2, A, B, and so on, clearly labeled. Then you make it easier for the markers to award you marks. Common mistakes: explaining ethical threats in general without dealing with the matters in the scenario. Start explaining self-interest, self-review, and so on. Not describing the number of ethical matters in the question requirement and not suggesting safeguards when required to do so, isn't it? So read the question carefully and simply address the question requirements. Ignore that typing error there. Okay. Right. That is in as far as ethics is concerned. Remember, we had terms of reference, but we've gone further and want to look at audit reviews and reports in more detail. Again, we saw them when we were looking at auditing standards. Okay. Candidates may be required to explain the following in terms of the reviews. Comparative information. We must know what comparative information is. Okay, I've got this set of financial statements again. I hope you are able to see it. Okay, if you look at this set of financial statements, this is revenue. Okay, let's go to, okay, just a second. Okay, the statement of financial position. It has got 2024 figures, the current figures. Okay, the current figures, 2024, and then it has got 2023 figures. These are comparative figures. Are we together, colleagues? These are comparative figures. We've got the 2024 column. We've got the 2023 figures. These are comparative figures. So you may be asking questions surrounding that, isn't it? Are we together, colleagues? Candidates may be required to explain comparative information. And the two main types of comparative information are the comparative figures and the comparative financial statements. Let's go back. If we are not sure, go back to our study materials. You may be required to explain the other information contained in the documents containing financial statements according to ISA 720. You may be required to explain subsequent events, giving examples. What are subsequent events? And give examples. You may be required to critique a suggested opinion. They give you an opinion. This is the evidence that has been obtained, and this is the opinion suggested by the audit senior. Can you comment? You must be able to say this opinion is correct considering these facts. If it's not, you must be able to say, no, it is not correct, isn't it? Candidates may be required to explain the forms of opinion and the circumstances that could be issued. In other words, modified opinion, to be able to explain what that is, what that means, qualified opinion, adverse opinion, or disclaimer of opinion. Candidates may be required to explain the meaning and use of elements of the audit report, including the going concern paragraph, material uncertainty with regards going concern paragraph, the emphasis of matter paragraph, the other matter paragraphs. You may be required. Admittedly, the requirements, colleagues, are vast. There's a lot that we have to learn. That's the whole idea. We are experts in accounting and auditing. We are the experts, so we need to learn and understand all these things. There's nothing like it's too much. No, this is what the syllabus requires, and we are supposed to have this knowledge. Are we together? Okay, now let's look at the examinations, reviews and reports and examinations. Explain the responsibilities of management with regards to subsequent events, adjusting and non-adjusting events, key audit matters, the possible forms of modification. I think we've already talked about that, isn't it? Now, the common mistakes in terms of review and reports, inability to explain audit risks with regards opening balances. Remember, opening balances is coming under the topics of reviews and so on. What is we must know if in a risky question, for example, and we're supposed to identify risks, and the question says or suggests that, not even suggests, it says we are auditing this client for the first time, then immediately it must click in our minds that the opening balances could be misstated. Because if the opening balances are misstated, they will impact the current year figures. Are we together? So we should be able to identify the audit risks with regards opening balances, with regards subsequent events and comparative information. Lack of understanding of accounting provisions for subsequent events. A lot of us show or have shown that we don't understand the accounting standard for subsequent events, which is IAS number 10, which gives examples of adjusting and non-adjusting events. So first of all, we need to understand that standard. Then we need to understand the provisions of the auditing standard ISA 560 on what the auditor needs to do with regards adjusting and non-adjusting events. The risk there really is that the accountants in the office, the preparers of financial statements, may inappropriately deal with the adjusting and non-adjusting events. Are we together, colleagues? Very important. Unable to use the information in the scenario to explain subsequent events, or failure to explain the forms of opinion and the circumstance. We fail to explain when a qualified opinion should be issued, when an adverse opinion should be issued. Failing to critique simple suggested report where the basis of opinion is on top, the opinion paragraph is below, and we fail to identify that. And yet we said we must know the provisions of ISA 700, isn't it? Okay, failure to suggest with justification the opinion under given circumstances. We are given information, can you suggest an opinion? And we fail to do that. We just end up saying qualified opinion or an adverse opinion. It's not good enough. What the examiner wants is to establish whether you would know how you would come up with a particular form of opinion. Clear lack of knowledge and understanding of the paragraphs such as key audit matters, emphasis of matter, and other matter paragraphs, whereby the students sometimes are not able to tell when they've been inappropriately used. And all that, again, colleagues, it simply cannot work. We're together. We are going towards the end. Very soon we'll give you time to explain. Really, I think the emphasis here is we don't need to have ideas about our subject matter. We must know. I always give an example of doctors or pilots. Imagine if doctors only had ideas. The doctors got an idea of how to undertake an operation. And then how many patients would be willing to go and lie on the operation table for and at the hands of doctors who have an idea? Or pilots just have an idea. They are flying 10 kilometers in the air and the light goes on and they don't know what to do. They say, but what is this light and so on? So if those can be required to know and understand to that extent, it's exactly the same with us. Our profession requires that we have good knowledge. And the reason is simple, colleagues. There is a lot of concern worldwide where companies are failing. And the question that is being asked everywhere is why are companies failing when they are being audited, when accounts are being prepared by qualified accountants? So our profession is really put into a corner and we must explain why. And hence we need this knowledge to be able to do the right work. Otherwise, we can put to risk our audit firms. If they are sued for professional negligence, then they will be found wanting and then they may end up paying compensation, huge sums of money for professional negligence. Let's look at the common causes of failure by students in these particular papers. Most of what we are going to go through actually has been repeated in the examiner's comments, which a good number of students don't even bother to actually read through those examiner's reports. I don't know. That is the communication, official communication by the institute. Look, these are the causes of you failing. But some students feel they are so busy they will not go through those. They contain quite a lot of valuable information. And so we are going to repeat some of the contents of those reports. Attempting less than the required 4 questions. And I think I did explain to you for both papers how many people attempted less than 4. And usually, not a single one of the 27 or whatever actually passed the exam. Occasionally, there are students, I think I've seen at the advanced level, where 3 questions are attempted and someone passes, marginally passes. But usually, if you attempt less than the required number of questions, colleagues, it may be advisable to start preparing for the next exam, because it's very unlikely that you actually go through. You will need all the marginal marks. You just have to manage your time. Leaving parts of questions unattempted. Some students will tick they have attempted 4. When you add the marks that they have not even done anything, part A there, part D there, it adds up to more than 1 question actually, more than 1 optional question, which is just as good as attempting less than what? Less than 4. So a very significant number of candidates actually attempt less than 4, because there's evidence that when you look at the scripts, a lot of blanks are there. The only people who probably are happy are the markers, because when there's nothing written, then it's faster to mark. But in as far as the student is concerned, then you lose marks and so on. You see? Not using information in the scenario, we've talked about that. Not addressing the question requirements. Make sure you understand the question requirements before you put pen on paper. Question could be on audit risks. Candidates deal with business risks. And you lose easy marks like that. Candidates not addressing question requirements in multi-requirement questions where they're saying you do this and do that. Make sure you address both. Put short headings so that you see yourself that have addressed both requirements. Are we all together, colleagues? Because when there is a multi-requirement question, it means there are marks awarded even for the other part of the question. Clear lack of knowledge of some topics. In other words, that sometimes when students just write anything, auditing goes. Anything, and I mean anything. You are answering a question not related, but probably correct in terms of auditing, but not answering the question. No marks will be awarded to such answers. No clear understanding of provisions of auditing standards. Candidates are required to answer questions in line with auditing standards. You may not remember the auditing standard references, but know the provisions. And also the exam questions will quote auditing standards. Now, agony is when you don't know the auditing standard, it means you can't deal with such a question. We are required, colleagues, to know these standards. There's nothing like there are too many. There are not too many. The important ones, we need to learn, we need to know. Actually, we need to know and learn beyond the exams. In other words, even after we've graduated, we need to know this information. If it's accounting standards, we must know the accounting standards. If it's auditing standards, we need them as we work as auditors. Poor or lack of knowledge of specific accounting requirements. This is a very serious one, where a lot of students, they lack knowledge of the accounting, fair value accounting, accounting estimates, and therefore they are not able to explain the risks contained in those figures and to suggest suitable audit procedures. Okay. Poor handwriting, making it difficult for markers to read solutions. It's a fact. If you can't read it, colleagues, it means no one else can read it. So if you can't write clearly, it's very difficult. These things are not marked by computers. They are human beings who try to make out what is it that the student is trying to write. If you can't read it, they can't read it. Wrong numbering of solutions. This is very common. Risk being marked wrong as a result. The extent of this was higher at the June 25 examination diet, where you are answering question 4, but you put question 3 there, or you change your mind. Honestly, let's fail for good reasons, not for a bit of carelessness like that. Because there's a risk that the marker may think you have got the wrong answer to the correct question. It's a risk. There are quality control systems in place to try and avoid that risk. But it is there. It is possible. It can happen. Are we together? Writing in margins. This one I think I need to emphasize. Writing in the margins. We know the answer booklet has got 2 margins, one on the left, one on the right. And it clearly says we should not write, do not write in this margin. And yet, honestly, students write in the margins. Now, those margins are meant for the examiners. Now, that's why your marks are supposed to be put. And then you write your answer there. Even if they put in a red pen, it's possible that they can miss those marks when picking them up. So let's just follow simple instructions. Do not write in the margin. Writing too much for marks on offer. If it's a 2-mark question, don't write half a page. You are wasting time. Use your judgment. Don't write too much. Writing everything and anything about a topic. This is where now someone is not sure and they just write anything audit related. Even if it's not relevant, that is another cause of exam. No marks will be awarded. And there's clear evidence sometimes. I think there's evidence of a lot of self-study and short tuition period. To go through, colleagues, to go through this book, the auditing manual, it requires a good 4 to 6 months if you are starting it for the first time. You can only prepare for 3 months. If you are rewriting, maybe you would have gone through. But if you are starting from scratch, you need a good 5 to 6 months of proper tuition so that you understand the principles. Otherwise, you will find that actually the cost becomes more because either you have to resit the exam several times and you're paying in terms of exam fees. So sometimes we must make the right judgment and look for a tuition provider who can help us to go through this. Poor presentation of answers, I think, is one of them. Okay. It says the numbering of solutions, use same numbering if we can, as the one that is in the question. If the solution is A, it should be A. If the question is A, we must put A, A1, and so on. Are we together? Follow instructions. Don't start a new question on the same page as the end of a previous one. I think it's the, let me just see. Is it the question paper or the answer sheet? I think it's the answer sheet, which clearly says, don't start a new question, answering a new question on the end of another one. And the students do exactly that. Now, we are saying it here now. In 2 weeks' time, some students will just say, look, it doesn't matter. It actually matters. You can end up being marked wrong. You risk. There's a risk. So please just follow instructions. Correctly tick attempted questions in the correct box, and do not tick where it's reserved for marks. Honest. It's very clear. I think the where students are supposed to tick is in the middle. Then the bottom one is for the examiners. Don't tick there. Don't write anything there. Just tick correctly in the right boxes and so on, isn't it? Okay. It says points answering the question requirements should be clearly shown as against general writing in most cases with few or no relevant points. In other words, it's not the quantity of writing, colleagues, that will help us pass the exam, but it is the points. We explain it clearly, leave a line, another point, clearly, leave a line, and move on. Then the examiners will be able to read and give you marks. I think the next few slides you'll be able to see. For instance, identify and explain, we've already seen in the illustration that we had. And you put A and B next to each other. You don't have to answer A first, and then you answer B second time. You're wasting time. The first part says identify and explain. The next one suggests a suitable audit response. It's better you deal with these there and then, rather than you try to attempt A, and then you go back through the same scenario and attempt B. The alternative presentation is as shown on this next slide, where you are saying A, you explain the audit risks, and then B, the audit responses. But take note, number 1 in B should be related to number 1 in A. Number 2 in B should be related to number 2 in A, and so on. Are you together, colleagues? It's very, very important. Otherwise, you will confuse the examiner. I think it's not the examiners or the markers to start hunting and saying, now, where is the response for laws and regulations? Maybe, and sometimes, interestingly, you will find that there will be 3 audit risks here, then the students will have 4 responses, and yet they've only explained 3. Let's just do the right thing, colleagues. We must be able to match and relate one to the other. So the order is quite important, isn't it? Okay. And before we move on then to questions, I think we'll have enough time. Let's look at the exam technique. What is it that we can do that can enhance our chances of passing the exam in, is it 12 days time? I think it's 12 or 13 days time. So the objective really is to enhance our chances of passing the exam if well followed. And even well-prepared candidates could fail if they mismanage themselves. I think it's important to know this. Even when you are well-prepared, if you don't manage yourself well in the exam, you can actually fail the exam. Remember, all 100% all 50% must be scored in the exam in the 3 hours. The aim is at scoring 50% and go for easy marks, which are always scattered across the question paper. They are a lot more than 60-70% of easy marks. Go for those and don't give up. And so to start with, we have to consider time management. We must understand this very clearly, colleagues. For the 40-mark question, it's 72 minutes. 72 minutes means 1 hour, 12 minutes, and no more. For a 25-mark question under DA11, it's 45 minutes for one question. 45, which means for the 2 compulsory questions, it's 90 minutes, which is 1.5 hours. Now, no one will control you on how you manage the time. It's up to you. All I'm trying to suggest to you is that try and answer these questions in the time given. If you start answering question number 1 and you are doing CA2.3, for example, you start answering it at 9 hours. By 12 past 10, you must be done. And you must be checking your time. Don't just write and keep on writing. As you go to part A, eventually part B, you check the time. How much time have I got remaining? And so on. so that you move and then you also attempt the remaining parts. Because if you start overrunning, you may end up spending 2 hours or 1.5 hours on question 1 at the expense of a marginal question which you require. Are we together, colleagues? Usually, it is the easy marks, the first few marks that are easy to make. So the more you go into the question, even if you spend an additional 30 minutes after 1 hour, 12 minutes, it means really you have actually explained. So you're just wasting time. Are we together? So let's use the 15 minutes reading time effectively. Attempt the required 4 questions. Need the marginal marks. We need the marginal marks. Take great care in deciding on the optional questions not to be attempted. In other words, when isolating a question, when selecting the optional questions to answer, make sure you isolate the most difficult one to avoid changing your mind, having gone into one question for 20 minutes. Then you are in trouble. You end up panicking. Are we together? Attempt all parts of the questions and use common sense where necessary. You can use common sense. What is important is to explain. You are better off using common sense and trying to answer a question. The markers may find something that they can award you marks on. Are we together? Use information in the scenario. Be skeptical. Solutions most likely will be in the scenario. It's very unlikely, colleagues, that they can ask you to identify and explain things that are not in the scenario. It's actually not possible. Ensure points are clear and avoid overwriting. You use marks on offer in deciding how much to write. If it's 4 marks, maybe 4 valid points. If it's 4 risks and safeguards or responses and it's 8 marks, it means 1 mark for the risk, 1 mark for the response. And we should not overspend. Cover the whole syllabus in preparing for the examination and be guided by the syllabus weightings, which I think we explained quite adequately as we started. And then, of course, attempt examination standard questions during exam preparation. Colleagues, a majority of us, I think, we do exam practice in the exam. It simply cannot work. You can set your own examination question. You can pick a past examination question paper and sit for 3 hours. Try to answer those questions and then go to the solution and compare what you have written against the suggested solutions. You need to do that because that will give you confidence. If you don't do that, you are panicking, we will end up panicking, and you're going to practice in the exam. Any slight variation will throw you out. Are we together? So past examination questions are very, very important, including reading past exam questions and answers. You just put yourself on a program. I will read 2 questions in the morning and 2 solutions. For 10 days, you would have read through maybe 20 or 30. That will increase your knowledge levels. It will help you know how questions come, how answers are supposed to be presented, and so on. Are we together? Attempt a mock examination under exam conditions if you can. It doesn't have to be anyone administering it to you. There are many questions you can pick at random, any question paper, and attempt it. Or if you are fluent, efficient in typing, you can actually set your own exam paper, pick a compulsory question, pick optional questions from different papers and type them. And then after a week of doing that, you sit and attempt to answer that under exam conditions in 3 hours and then compare with your answer, isn't it? And then, of course, we should mind our own business in the exam. Do not be disturbed by other candidates. So there's a temptation that when you see others asking for the second writing part, then you start saying, but what is it that me, I don't know? These people are now going to the second writing part. Just mind your own business and concentrate. Mind your business, mind that you are writing an exam. Don't start thinking about the next exam in March or thereabout. Just do your best. There are easy marks, we go for the easy marks. Clearly number your solutions using the numbering format. I think we've talked about that. Use short headings in your answers to make it easier for the marker to see your answer. Brief headings. Don't copy the whole question. Some students will end up copying the whole question. You're wasting time. The idea of using short headings is basically to attract the eyes and attention of the markers. Are we together, colleagues? Use short but clear sentences in answering questions, and if possible, leave a line between points. Don't write too much. Cannot hide through long paragraphs. Markers will read everything. It's disappointing sometimes. It's disappointing long 2-page answer, but only maybe 3 marks. Someone has written 2 pages, but only scores 3, sometimes nothing. So it's really not about the quantity, it's about the quality, what is being written, colleagues. Not that there are always easy marks in every examination paper. Go for these and do not stress over what you do not know. If you find something, maybe there's just a calculation where you did not even go through and so on, forget it. Pass mark is 50%. Go for the easy marks. You can still pass, even when you don't know a few marks and so on. Are you together? So really, theoretically, you can fail to answer 50% and still pass using the other 50%. Are you together? If it's a difficult paper, then it is difficult for everyone. But still, we can see people still pass. So if it's challenging for everyone. So we must fight to the end until the invigilator says stop. We must go on and fight and make use of our time. If we think we have finished answering questions before it's time, go through what you have written. Maybe there's something that you can add, maybe there's something that you omitted and so on. You can get 50 marks wrong and still pass the exam. I think we've got 13 days to the examination day. 13 days. These are sufficient days. A student, you can read, you can actually go through this manual in 13 days, and I mean it. You can go through it, even assuming you have only scanty knowledge and so on. In 13 days, you can go into a serious sacrifice of leisure and so on, and go through with a view to learning something that will help you pass the exam. I'm sure that is not the case. We don't need to do that because we would have been preparing and so on. So we should not panic now and in the examination room. We should not panic. Panic is a very bad thing. It will cause you to lose even the easy marks that we may actually could have scored. So basically, that marks the end of our presentation. We still have time, I think, and that was the idea. We literally have almost an hour in which we can interact with colleagues. And feel free to ask any questions, and we'll attempt to answer them. If we are not able to answer them now, we'll still either refer them to Zika, and you are going to be given a feedback. So I can only wish you well and encourage you that we should not be fear. Let's just be determined and let's put in our best, and we are going to pass the examination if we do that. And so at this point in time, I will take any questions. Maybe we can take 1, 2, 3 questions. We attempt to answer them, and then we go on to another set and so on, colleagues. I might as well comment. I can see there are 38 participants, probably including me and the Zika staff. And yet the students who are going to sit for this paper could be 100, 120, and so on. And that is where the challenge is, colleagues. These meetings are quite important. It's an initiative that the Institute has put in place for which we are not paying any fee. If there's any cost, it's to the Institute and not to the student. And so really, sometimes we miss these opportunities. So any questions, please? Do I see a hand now? Okay. Anyone, any comments, please, let's comment. Let's not keep quiet. Bring out anything that you want to clarify. We have enough time. There's a lot of time, and therefore we need to interact, colleagues. If you have any issue, unmute, and then we move on. You ask your question. Where is the silence? Mr. Katungu?
Hello, Mr. Munguluma.
Hello, Mr. Katungu. I'm encouraging them to ask. Maybe they want to hear from you.
Thank you. Colleagues, any questions that you have? Any clarity that you would want to seek?
That is the main objective of this meeting, colleagues, is for us to interact. I can see, okay, maybe someone has sent. Okay, no, I thought there was a message that needed attention. That's the whole idea of this meeting, colleagues, so that you can interact. Yes.
Bernard Kapampa speaking.
Yes, Bernard.
I think I'm glad that you have clarified, sir, that presentation of the answers is important. I think I almost asked on the same, where we are told to identify maybe the risk or threat and the safeguards. You put them in form of a column, connecting maybe question A and question B onto one answer. I think that's on that one I'm clear. But
Yes.
just also to be sure, obviously there's a compulsory question that is asked, and then there's the others. Just so that I'm clear, I can attempt in whatever order the questions they come through, isn't it?
Yes.
It should
Yes.
be
Okay.
problems.
Let's say you are saying maybe question 1, isn't it?
Yes, I start with question 5.
You start with question what?
For example, I start attempting question 5. I don't think that can be of any consequence.
There's no problem. As long as you clearly label your questions, you can start with any question, actually. Are we right together, colleagues? The only thing, my advice to you would be as follows, and it's good you have asked this question. I think we've come across a few students who attempt the compulsory question last. Remember, this is the question that carries the highest number of marks. And in any case, colleagues, you have no choice but to answer this question. So if I were the one, I would actually want to deal with this this thing here, the compulsory question, because first and foremost, it carries 40 marks. When I'm still energetic, I would rather deal with it. Whether you postpone it, you will still have to answer it. The only risk that you run is when you start with the smaller questions, you end up having no time to finish the compulsory question. And believe me, and I might as well say this, most students who pass these exams, both DA11 and the CA2.3, do very well in the compulsory question. Because if you look at your examiner's reports, colleagues, you will agree with me that the performance in the optional section is very bad. So bad that people get 6 out of 20, 5 out of 20. Are you getting the point, Bernard? And so you may want to start with the optional part where anything can happen. And yet, in the scenario question or the compulsory question carries more marks, and it's actually much easier because you are talking about identifying and so on. You see, are we right together? I'll say something. I'm not here to give tuition. I'm not a tuition provider. I'm just giving consultants on what the terms of reference. If I were a student myself, for example, and there's a question, maybe let's take this one, which was in September. And the first part, there's a part which says ethical issues and audit risks, and even internal controls. I can actually answer these at the same time, because you have to do whatever you can to try and save time. All I can do is, it says describe. I will say part A1, I will answer A1 and 2. Then when I come to B, describe six ethical issues. And I will just leave a page for 6, and I'm sure a page is enough. I will say ethical issues B. Then I will say C, audit risks and safeguards. Another page and a half, or maybe 2 pages. You pay for this paper. I will reserve it for that. And then internal controls. Then as I read the scenario, when I find it's an ethical issue, I slot it in on the ethical section. When it's a risky issue, I slot it on the risky section. Because what will happen is, if you do them independently, it means when answering part B of ethics, you have to go through this whole thing again. Are we right together? And then when you come to risk, again, you have to go through the same. So really, there's always something that one can do to try and speed up, because the issue here is about time, colleagues. But to answer your question, you can answer questions in any order, to an extent that even within a question, even if you started with answering part E, it's fine. But as long as you will label these questions very clear, but logic would require that you start A, B, C, D. But I don't see anything wrong if you started with answering part B. But you label it clearly that this is part B of my solution. Then the markers will see that this is an answer to part B, and then they'll mark it. Are we together, colleagues? I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
There's another hand from Mangwe.
Okay, go ahead, please. Unmute and ask your question. Mambwe?
Lawrence Mangwe.
Yes, Lawrence Mangu, yes, yeah, but okay, now he's unmuted. Yes, Lawrence.
Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon. My question is on can one be able to pass this particular course before you attempt D9 or financial reporting?
Okay. Can one pass this course before attempting D9 or financial? Yes, they can. They could pass if they adequately prepare. But remember what we said. Really, I think that's why D9 comes before D11. That is why 2.1 comes before 2.3. I think there must be some logic in that sense. Are you getting the point? Because, like we said, you're talking about accounting standard. Imagine if you have no accounting knowledge, and in auditing, we don't teach accounting. And that is where the trick is, you see. When a lecturer is teaching auditing, he's assuming that actually you have done accounting. And so you are disadvantaged to that extent. But you can pass. Yes, you can pass. I think to answer your question, you can pass, but it takes a lot of effort, isn't it? It is easier if we were talking about our sessions, we are talking about IS number 10, for example. You would have done it probably in D9 or 2.1. And therefore, it's not new when you are looking at it from an auditing perspective, you see. So it is possible, my dear brother, if you haven't done it and you are sitting, just be courageous, be man enough and be able to do your best. You can, if you study the whole syllabus, if you go through the past exam questions and answers, we can take it that what you will lose out is basically maybe 30% of not you having done accounting. The other 70%, you can still pass from that, isn't it? Okay. Anyone else? There's
Okay,
still time,
thank you
colleagues.
so much.
Yeah. What is your view? Let's speak. Let's communicate. Why is the performance sometimes bad? Is it you have nothing to say or what? What could be the problem? Let's feel free to chat. The standard of answers, I might as well tell you that sometimes the standard of answers is quite bad. The communication skills and colleagues, these are professional exams. And so chancing cannot work and should not be allowed to work. Only people who meet the syllabus requirements will be able to go through. But can we talk, please? There are still, I'm sure there must be people who have got issues. If we have no issues, if we have understood, if we are okay, then that's quite good. The exam is in 13 days' time. Okay, we'll still leave the meeting open for those who may still have questions.
Okay, Lawrence Mango is back again. On the
Yes.
reading time, especially for this same particular course, I think
Yeah.
you discover that you take a lot of time reading scenarios and understanding. Is there a specific techniques or method that you can use to quickly understand the question and be able to attempt? Because I feel, is it 15 minutes?
Yes.
Yeah, it's somehow not enough for someone to be able to analyze a scenario. You know, there are a lot of scenarios in this particular.
Yeah, but what is the purpose of that 15 minutes? Is it meant for you? Because you are not answering during the 15 minutes, you are not really starting to write on the answer sheet, if I understand it correctly, isn't it? Really, the best way, the only way you can learn how to quickly understand is by practice makes perfect. I think that's the English adage. You go through as many, the papers, the exams are deliberately designed to give a lot of information. It's part of the exam to see whether you're able to navigate through under pressure and be able to pass. Are you getting the point? The 15 minutes, in my view, it depends. People have different use of that 15 minutes. I think it makes you settle down, first of all, because even as you go in the exam, you might have certain topics you don't even want to see in the exam. So within the 15 minutes, you will be able to say, okay, this is what the exam is, and therefore the pressure will come back to normal, and then you are yourself. And also, I don't know, we can discuss. I think the 15 minutes should be used. First of all, if I were the one writing the exam, I would quickly look at the requirements. Are you getting the point, my brother? I will not really go through the scenario first. I will look at the requirements. Because by going through the requirements, I will make an assessment and say this paper is manageable. It's not. I will know the battle ahead. Within less than 2 minutes, should be able to look through the requirements of all the questions and so on. Are you together? You look at the requirements, so that you stabilize and settle down. And then you can, since you do that in less than 3-4 minutes, then you can go through the compulsory question again and run through it. I suppose they allow you to write on the question paper. Someone can confirm with me. If they allow you, for example, to write on the question paper, as you quickly read through, and the skills of reading and understanding can only come with practice, colleagues. It's practice. There's nothing else. So if you are reading through, you have already read that there's risk in the requirement and there are ethics. So as you read through, you can either underline or if you want, you can say for risks, I'll put 1. For ethics, I'll put 2. So you identify them. So that when you start answering the question, you just go straight to those, you see. Are you together, colleagues? Unless someone has a different thinking or how they can go about it. But if you are allowed to highlight, then you can highlight ethics. You can go with a green highlighter and a red one. Where there is a risk, I highlight in red. Where there is an ethical issue, I highlight in another color. And by the time he's done with the 15 minutes, the long question, I would have done a bit of justice to it. Then when answering now, I'll just go and say, now, where did I highlight this? I'll just expand now those ethical issues using the knowledge that we have. Are you together? You would have highlighted, and then you use that knowledge. And so on. I think the 15 minutes is not meant to give you enough time to read the question. It's actually, at one time, it wasn't even there in some exams. But they're just giving you 15 minutes to read through. You will settle down, and then the 72 minutes, which is 1.8 minutes per mark, has for everything, including reading, writing, resting, and everything is within that time. So the time pressure is there, and it's supposed to be there, because otherwise, if you give people unlimited time, then everyone will manage, you see, and then maybe will not be able to assess correctly whether or not people really understood. I don't know whether that is clear enough or you have a different view.
Yeah, it's clear. Thank you so much for the clarity.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Mumbuluma, for that explanation. He posed back a question asking, are you allowed to write on your question paper during the reading time?
Yes.
And I didn't seem to get any response from you
students.
colleagues.
Yeah.
What has been your experience?
Yes.
Are you allowed to write in the question paper?
On the question paper, not on the answer sheet.
Yes, we are allowed to write in the question paper.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you so much, Ms. Chama, for that clarity. And indeed, like Mr. Mumbuluma has mentioned, the 15 minutes is just to bring you to speed in terms of what areas have been examined. You finally getting to note the key issues that are in the scenarios comes in when you are asked to start writing. That's when you are able to do the rest of the detailed reading. Okay? And one of the tips I think that he has emphasized is, in the 15 minutes for reading, know what you have been asked to do. Okay? So you will know, no, there's I need to identify business risks in this, so on and so forth. So that when you start reading, you are reading in mind and identify any risk that you come across.
Exactly.
You note it down.
Yes.
If it's ethical issues, the ethical issues that you come across, you note down. Okay? So that is how you are supposed to proceed with your exam writing.
Okay, I think that's clear enough, colleagues. Anything else? So really, from me, one would hope that this particular exam, I know we have few, obviously, compared to the number of people who probably would have entered for this exam, but make a difference. Let your script stand out and do your best. Then you pass the exam. Chancing, like I said, will not cannot work in auditing. You can't chance and hope that no, maybe this time and so on. It's either you will know or you do not know. But the point I think I'm trying to emphasize is that, colleagues, these exams are passable. If 22 people can pass, what is special about those 22 people? It means they prepared adequately. I mean, if you don't prepare adequately and you know you haven't prepared adequately, most likely you will be lucky to pass the exam. You'll be lucky, you know. In our times, we would know. You write an exam, you should be able to assess and say, I think I've passed. Because you are the one who was preparing, you are the one who has written the exam, and so on. But all in all, I think the Institute is showing goodwill by having these courses, and nobody, the marking team and everyone, feels good when students fail. There's no reason why they should feel good. Everyone gets concerned and gets happy when people perform. It means knowledge has been impacted on people and they've learned something. You see? Any comments, colleagues? Otherwise, eventually the meeting will close earlier.
Mr. Mumbuluma, there's a question from Susan Katende, but before I allow you to go for it, I thought I respond to the comment from Carol Mowola. So Carol Mowola responds to Messi Mulenga that says they allow to scribble on the question paper. So that is the correct position. You are allowed to write on the question paper, but not in the answer script.
No.
Okay? So if you were not allowed, then that was unfortunate.
Exactly.
Next time, please insist that you are allowed to do that. But most importantly, the way we are meeting you as students, we also meet examination centers where we bring to their attention some of these concerns that you are raising, like you are now saying that you were once not allowed to scribble down anything, because as far as we are concerned, you are allowed to do that. You are allowed to have your water. You are allowed to have your Coca-Cola or your Fanta in the exam room. So all these are some of the things you can make available if you need to. Okay? And then we move on to the question from Susan. For you, Mr. Mumbuluma, she asks, I would like to find out if audit procedures, I noticed you said producers, Susan, in an exam would have said it can't. There's no audit producers, but audit procedures, I'm assuming, is what you are asking.
Yes.
So I'd like to find out if audit procedures and substantive procedures are the same. Your comment on that one.
Okay. Audit procedures and the substantive procedures. Okay. What it is, auditors perform audit procedures at the 3 stages of the audit, colleagues. At the planning stage of the audit, they perform audit procedures. During the audit, when obtaining, during substantive, during tests of control, they obtain audit procedure. They perform audit procedures. During substantive stage of the audit, they perform audit procedures. We're together. Audit procedures is what the auditors do to gather evidence. Now, at all these 3 stages, there are different objectives. Okay, in planning the audit, they perform audit procedures to gain an understanding of the entity and its environment. And they use the same methods of obtaining audit evidence or performing audit procedures, such as inquiries or recalculation and so on, in planning the audit. When performing tests of control. Again, auditors perform audit procedures. We're together. And so even when performing substantive tests, they perform audit procedures. What is different is the objective of each of those audit procedures. In terms of substantive procedures or substantive audit procedures, this means they are done at the stage of what? Conducting audits with a view to obtaining evidence on whether or not the figures are misstated. The objective is to try and confirm whether or not the figures are wrong or misstated. So they will perform audit procedures. Are you together? Whereas in case of test of control, auditors will perform audit procedures again to test whether or not the controls are operating effectively. At planning the audit, the auditors will perform audit procedures to gain an understanding of the entity and its environment. So really, except in the exam, the questions may come something like explain the substantive audit procedures, which means now they don't want you to explain test of control. When they say explain the substantive audit procedures, that should be performed on receivables. So the aim will be on obtaining evidence on whether or not the figures or the assertions are materially misstated, you see. Are we together? And it's a very, very important topic, colleagues, and that is what auditing is, you see. Well, what happens is when auditors go out to conduct an audit, when the audit team goes out to conduct an audit, the audit assistants, maybe the junior staff, may not even know what audit procedures to perform. And so that's why we are learning how to develop audit procedures. They should be such that when you put them, you are telling the auditors, you do, when auditing receivables, number one, do the following. Number two, these are substantive audit procedures. And they should be able to follow these in performing audit procedures on the sample items that they would have selected. I hope I've answered her question honestly. If not, she can still make a follow-up question.
Yes, it's clear, sir.
Thank
I'm
you.
clear now.
Okay. Anyone else, colleagues? Any other questions, rather? Okay. We are patient. We are still waiting. Ask. Ask, colleagues. Ask.
There are some questions in the messages.
Some messages. Okay. Where are the messages? Let's see. Andrew.
Vincent says, can you shed more light on the substantive audit procedures? What's the best approach when giving your answers? Putting in mind the method, ZFS assertion, and how it relates to audit procedures.
Yeah, okay.
Then
we
the
deal with
other
that one
one
first. Okay. Go ahead.
The other one, what audit work is done on the review stage and the planning stage of an audit? And of course, the last one is just a comment on whether the recording will be shared. Yes, we will share. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. What can you clarify the design or development of audit procedures? Okay, I'm trying to think of an illustration to use. Let's say impairment. I hope my accounting knowledge is still good. The accounting standard on impairment is IS number 36, for example. And maybe in the scenario, they tell you that the company carried out an impairment review, and the results of the impairment review have been taken into consideration in the figures contained in the financial statements. And so the requirement is, can you describe or explain 4 substantive audit procedures on impairment? Now, in other words, he's saying, what's the easiest way? The easiest way, first of all, I'm saying that it means I know the accounting for impairment. If I don't know the accounting for impairment, there's very little I can do. I don't think you can actually describe the audit procedures. Are we together? But here, there are some easy ones, actually, which you can get. I will inquire from management, for example, the workings for the impairment that have been done. Request management to provide the impairment review workings. That is an audit procedure. If there are any workings, then recalculate. If there's anything that requires recalculation, you recalculate for arithmetical accuracy. Now you can see I'm biased towards financial statement assertions because I'm saying for impairment, there are figures in the financial statements, and I want to see how they've determined the impairment, meaning they should have compared the carrying value and is it the value in use or something of the figures. I will write together. So I ask them, where are your workings? They give me. Then I recalculate. That is an audit procedure. I will write together. Then I would want to confirm that the carrying values that they've used are the correct ones by reviewing the draft accounts and confirming in the ledger that the carrying values they are comparing with are correct. Now you can see in saying that I'm saying so because I know the accounting. I would want to know how they determined the value in use. If it's, the impairment is what is the formula? An asset is impaired if its carrying amount is more than its value in use, I think. Yes. And then value in use depends on the discounted figures for the future and fair values. So the auditors have to now perform an audit procedure. I'll ask management, how did you determine the fair values? Are you together? That is an audit procedure because you are using those figures in determining whether or not there is impairment. So it's quite, that's why I kept on emphasizing on the need to know accounting. Let's give another example. Development expenditure, research and development. Companies, big companies, Trade Kings and other big companies, they spend millions of kwacha on research, pharmaceutical companies. And there is an accounting standard, I think it's IS number 38, which gives guidance. Ordinarily, all research and development expenditure must be written off to profit or loss account. So if, like in the example we gave in the slides, the company has spent so much money on research and development and 10 million has been capitalized, then they ask you, what are the audit procedures for that 10 million? Because the issue now is, if it is capitalized incorrectly, then the financial statements will be misstated. Are we together? And so in designing the audit procedure, what we are going to do is we inquire from management, one of the easy marks, inquire from management, what is the basis of you capitalizing the development costs? That's a mark. Are we together? And then inquire, they look at some of the expenditure, look at the invoices for some of the development expenditure to see that the figures are correct, arithmetical accuracy. Then he assess whether or not the development cost meets the criteria for capitalization. Now, why am I saying that? I have in mind the accounting standard, which gives guidance on when something should be capitalized. Are we together, colleagues? So there's a serious connection between accounting standards and auditing. And that's why, and I'll say it again, let's try and go through the accounting for certain areas so that at least we are not caught off guard. Because without that knowledge, it's very unlikely that we will develop suitable audit procedures, because all audit procedures are meant to confirm and check whether the figures have been appropriately stated, which means the auditors should know the accounting. So the easiest, the best is know the accounting. Where there are certain figures, like, for instance, they give you schedules. We said earlier on that management will give you schedules of maybe the tangible non-current assets, schedules of receivables, and so on. Easy marks. When you get that schedule, you just say, we'll check the arithmetical accuracy by taking a calculator and adding. That is auditing. And it's important, colleagues. It's auditing. You say you get a calculator and check that the schedule adds up correctly. Because if it is not added correctly, then it can result in a misstatement of financial statements. Then once you have checked the additions, another procedure you can take, even before you look at the complicated procedures, is to confirm that the figure on the schedule is the one that is in the general ledger. For completeness, that they agree. Because you don't want a schedule that is giving you a breakdown of a figure that is different from the general ledger. So, colleagues, basically it's the accounting I hope that will help you in some way. Someone wanted to know what work is done in planning and in reviewing the audit. In planning, at this stage of planning and audit, it means we have really not started the audit yet. We are just planning like the name is suggesting. If we are going to conduct an audit of Nakambala Sugar Estate, for example, Nakambala Sugar in Mazabuka, and it's the first time we are going to do the audit, which means we have little experience in that audit. And so we need to gain an understanding of what Nakambala Sugar Estate is. Who are they? What do they do? A lot of things. Most of the procedures will be for us to learn, to understand that entity. Because without understanding the entity, we won't be able to assess the risk. Because what you want is to assess the risk that something could go wrong in the financial statements. So most of the procedures done there through inquiries, through analytical procedures, okay, through observation, all are meant for us to gain an understanding so that we identify the risks and assess the risks that we have identified. What impact could they have on the financial statements? Because remember, at the end of the day, auditors have to form an opinion on the financial statements. The issue is about the financial statements. Whereas at the review stage, this is the final stage of the audit. We are now going towards the end of the audit, isn't it? The audit will have been supervised throughout the conduct of the audit. Senior people in the audit team will be supervising. But at the review stage, at the end, towards the end, there are certain things that have to be done, like going concern. We have to do work on going concern. We have to do work on subsequent events to ensure that subsequent events have been correctly accounted for, and so on. Together, we have to review the misstatements, the conclusions. Now that the audit is almost coming to an end, what is the extent of uncorrected misstatements compared to the materiality level, for example? And that's what I expected some people to ask, things to do with materiality, for example. We need to be very clear. Together. So at the review stage, we are going towards the end of the audit. Eventually, conclusions and eventually the opinion will be formed and the audit report issued. That we are together, colleagues. Okay, talking about materiality, it's very important that you understand what is meant by materiality. Let's know materiality for the financial statements as a whole. Let's remember materiality, performance materiality, and the difference between the two. We need to know those. Okay. I hope I have addressed those concerns. Okay. Yes, colleagues. Otherwise, Mr. Katunga, I leave it up to you to decide when we shall close. You want us to still remain open for people who are still thinking about it?
Thank you. Maybe we can take the last two. The first one is kindly explain further on ISA 700 and modified report.
Mm-hmm.
Then the second one, what is the difference between analytical procedures and test of details?
Okay. Okay. Wait. Okay. Okay. Right. Let's begin with the ISA 700. Okay. I just want to refer to it in the study manual. Remember, okay, where is it? You just give me a second. ISA 726. Okay. Remember, what is the objective of the auditor? Is to form an opinion on the financial statements, on whether the financial statements show a true and fair view. Okay? In other words, the accounts show the true reflection. Remember, we said the issue here is about separation between management and ownership, where the owners don't take part in the financial running of the company. And so they require assurance from the auditors. Now, ISA 700 is, they are saying here, and modify, let me see, what are they referring to? It says, it's an unmodified opinion, okay? It states that the auditor shall express an unmodified opinion when the auditor concludes that the financial statements show a true and fair view. That's when they issue an unmodified opinion. Are you together, colleagues? Okay, when the auditors conclude that the accounts show a true and fair view. In other words, their auditors are happy. They have no matter of concern. And what this standard does, it gives the basic elements, the basic elements. And these basic elements is basically how the report should be presented. It starts with, for instance, a title. It must have a title. It must have an addressee. It must be addressed to someone. It must have an opinion paragraph. The next paragraph is opinion. Then it goes on. Then the next one is basis for opinion. Then going concern. The way they are here is how they are supposed to be. And I've tried and I've gotten this actual set of financial statements to try and demonstrate this. We're together. When you look on my right, I have an actual audit report. The real one, it's a real one. It's a live for financial statements ended on 31st December 2024. And you can see it has a title, just like this one has a title. It has an opinion paragraph, just like this one has opinion. Deloitte have no choice but to follow that standard. It has a basis of opinion. If the basis of opinion came above there, then that would be wrong. Are you together? So you find that what these people have done is exactly what is in the standard. And the idea is to make audit reports comparable. It makes them easier for the users of financial statements to compare one report and another. Are we together? So the ISA 700 gives a standard and modified opinion report with an unmodified opinion. Are we together, colleagues? Now, since you have asked this, allow me in less than 2 minutes to explain about ISA 705 and the modification of the auditor's opinion. I think it's important, and listen to this when you get your presentation. ISA 705 gives auditors 3 options when they've got a matter of concern. They can either issue a qualified opinion or an adverse opinion or a disclaimer. And so you look at 2 situations. First, where the auditors have obtained sufficient appropriate evidence. We assume that they've obtained all the evidence they require. Now they need to make a choice on which form of modification, which means they've got a matter of concern. First of all, if that matter of concern is not material, then it cannot result in a modification because it is not material. Remember, the financial statements should be materially misstated for us to modify. So how do they decide which form of modification? When there's a matter of concern and it is material, the next test should be, is it pervasive? If it is material and not pervasive, now that you have to know, because you need to use this knowledge in evaluating. If it's material and not pervasive, then the auditor will issue a qualified opinion. They will say that except for this matter, the accounts show a true and fair view. If it is material and pervasive, then the auditors will issue an adverse opinion and conclude that the accounts do not show a true and fair view. Now, in so doing, something happens to ISA 700 elements. If you issue a qualified opinion, colleagues, where ISA 700 says you should say opinion, you should not, the name changes to qualified opinion. Where it says basis for opinion, it changes to basis for qualified opinion. If you issue an adverse opinion, the name changes to adverse opinion. The basis for opinion will change to basis for adverse opinion if you modify. Very important to note that. Are we together? Now, in the second situation, where the auditors do not obtain sufficient appropriate evidence, meaning there's a limitation of scope. Again, you go through the same test. Is the matter material? Yes, it is. Is it pervasive? No. Then you still issue a qualified opinion. So you have to use those tests. Even if you are given information, you must subject that information to these tests. Is it material? Yes. Is it pervasive? No. Then qualified opinion. Where there is a disclaimer, or in other words, you haven't obtained sufficient appropriate evidence. Is the matter material? Yes. Is it pervasive? Yes. Then you issue a disclaimer. You can't issue an adverse because you haven't obtained sufficient evidence. You issue a disclaimer of opinion, and the auditors will say, we are not able to form an opinion. And then the opinion paragraph will change from being opinion to being disclaimer of opinion and the basis for disclaimer of opinion. Are we together, colleagues? So please, let's make sure we understand. Go read through that chapter. Not very complicated, really. read through that chapter and understand, because you are expected to be able to critique and say, I think the information given suggests that the opinion should either be an adverse or qualified, and explain very simply, actually, at this level, that you have an understanding of those, you see. Okay, that was the first question. The next one talked about the difference between analytical procedures and tests of detail. Now, first of all, the heading is substantive procedures. That's what the heading is. In other words, on top, what you have is substantive procedures. Okay, the way I have put here, substantive procedures. Now, they are of two types. The substantive procedures are of two types. There are analytical procedures and tests of detail. Are we together, colleagues? So the main heading is that these are substantive procedures whose aim is to test whether or not figures are materially misstated. And there are two types of substantive procedures. There are analytical procedures and tests of details. Analytical procedures are basically analysis. The way I was analyzing the exam results for June and September, I was making comparisons and making conclusions from my analysis. So auditors do perform analytical procedures, basically ratio analysis, which you learn in accounting, and make conclusions. Are we together? For example, if there's an increase in revenue from one year to another of 10%, and the cost of sales does not increase, and that's analytical procedures, then it means there's a problem. Either revenue or cost of sales is wrong, because you expect them to move at the same pace. If revenue has gone up, cost of sales should go up. That is analytical procedures. And you are obtaining evidence about specific figures. If the auditors want to test depreciation for the year, they can use analytical procedures by using the policy of the company and computing the depreciation and compare with the depreciation that is in the financial statement. That's what analytical procedures are. Whereas tests of detail are the detailed substantive tests depending on the assertions. Are we together? Like the ones I was trying to illustrate on impairment and so on. And so the issue here is auditors should always perform tests of detail. You cannot do an audit simply by doing analytical procedures, because these are basically checking figures in total. And there's a likelihood that there could be errors and so on. So they are saying auditors on all material items, they must perform tests of details and not necessarily rely on analytical procedures. But these are detailed tests. Those are basically ratios and so on, which auditors do use, a very efficient way of conducting audits, but it must be used with a lot of care. I think that is what I would say on that one. Okay, Mr. Katunga, unless you've got any others, I hope I've answered those satisfactorily.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mumbuluba. At this point, I think we can conclude. It's like we are getting back to the same comments. There's one from Cynthia, which says, kindly shed more light on planning materiality and performance materiality. And if you have a question on materiality, please highlight on the computations and how to determine whether the matter was material according to ISA 320.
Okay. Materiality, colleagues, is a very important concept. The objective of the auditors is to obtain evidence on whether financial statements are materially misstated or not. The question is, what is material? It's a matter of professional judgment on the auditor. And so what that standard, ma'am, if you go through that standard, it gives you some starting benchmarks. It gives you guidance on how materiality should be determined. This is a figure that auditors must determine in planning the audit, at the beginning of the audit. Based on the risk assessment, they must be able to say, now, what is it that we consider to be a material misstatement? Are we together? Why do they need to determine that? So that when they come across misstatements, they're able to compare them and say, is this misstatement above this materiality level? Okay, that is one of the uses of materiality figure. And so the standard ISA 320 you've mentioned, it gives, for example, when you are doing materiality, you can use percentage, maybe on, is it profit after tax? I can't remember, you can check it, but it will give and say between 5 to 10% of profit after tax. That can be the starting point of materiality. Now I explain it, I think it will be clear. So between 5 to 10%. So if you are given, I think it's revenue. So if you are given a revenue figure, you have to compute 5% of that revenue figure and 10% of that revenue figure. For example, if this is 200,000 and this is 500,000, the upper limit. These are the standard says you can do that. And then now, to decide on the materiality level to use on a particular client, you have to look at other factors, including risks. If, for example, this is a new client, you might want to set materiality at a lower level, because the higher the risk, the lower the materiality level. Remember? Are we together? So we might set it at 200. So they will compute that. Then depending on the risk, they will say materiality will be set at 200,000. This is just a guidance, a guideline. And we just have to show that we understand this. There are other percentages, I think half to 1% and so on, which are given. But basically the principle is that you compute those two and then justify a particular materiality level. For instance, I would say materiality is 200,000 in this case. That means that becomes the materiality for the financial statements as a whole. And then comes in the principle of performance materiality. Having computed that materiality level, auditors want to reduce the risk that uncorrected or undetected misstatements will exceed that. In other words, instead of saying anything above 200, below 200 is immaterial, the auditors can set a performance materiality level, which should always be lower than this one calculated for the financial statements as a whole. So they might say, well, instead of using 200, we have computed 200 and recorded in our documentation 200, but we are going to use 100,000 as the materiality level. Are you together? Which means even a lower figure will excite the auditors, you see. So the key issue you can learn from this is performance materiality will always be lower than the materiality set for the financial statements as a whole. Are we together, colleagues? As if that's not enough, if there is any particular assertion or any particular item where the risk of misstatement is different and higher, you can have a materiality level for inventory alone and a separate performance materiality level for inventory alone. Are together, colleagues? Just go through that standard and so on. Then, of course, we must remember and know that materiality can be revised. If the auditors have set materiality at 200 and they had assumed that the controls are strong, and when you do the audit, you find that the controls are weak, we may revise. The standard allows that we can revise the materiality level. Are we together, colleagues? I think for the sake of understanding, I would rather leave it at that stage. I think I've given an illustration there, but just go through it as well. I'm sure you understand the standard will give guidance. Was that the only one, or did I think there was another question?
It's the last question.
Okay.
So for those asking about the presentation, we'll share the link through your email. Thank you. So we'll share a recording as well as a hard copy of the presentation itself for your reading. So at this point, wish to take this opportunity to thank every one of you that has made time to listen to this presentation. It is our hope that you have learned a number of items that will help you as you sit for your December 2025 examination session. Please ensure that you go beyond just the recording that we are going to share. Look back at your study material, practice like Mr. Mumbroma has emphasized. And when it gets to writing in the exam, make sure that you understand what you are responding to and not just picking and dropping anything for the markers to choose. Okay? I think there were a couple of questions surrounding whether one should start with question 1 or any other question that was mentioned, and I'll emphasize, please make sure that you start with what you are seeing. You are able to score as as many marks as possible. The secret lies in you clearly labeling the question number for the question you are attempting. Okay? And then within questions, there should be some logical flow to your answering. For instance, if A is related to B, and information in A first has to be established before you are able to attempt B, then it becomes illogical for you to start with B. Okay? Let your responding have some sequencing for matters that are related. Okay? So that we avoid even just have a picture of how it looks. You'll start question 1A, then next question 1D, question 1B, then next question 1E. I think it's just some total disorder that you are putting there. Much as we are saying you can start with any question, have some order in terms of how you go about it, attempting the questions that you have selected. Otherwise, thank you so much, Mr. Mumbuluma. Special thanks to you. And we look forward to yet another presentation by yourself in the near future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Wish you well, colleagues. Wish you well in your exam. Do not panic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the facilitation.